The air inside the Blackfall Spindle trade station tasted of recycled oxygen, ozone, and the copper tang of dried blood. It was a lawless hive of rusted metal spinning in the dark void of the terminus systems, a place where morality was the first thing stripped at the airlock. Cale Riven sat in the back corner of a dim gambling den called the Dead Man's Hand, staring at a hand of cards that was worth less than the synth liquor burning a hole in his stomach. He was 38 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the gray streaking his dark hair argued for 50. He wore a flight jacket that had seen better decades, the leather scuffed and peeling, stripped of any insignia that might identify him as a former officer of the Terran Coalition fleet. 2,000 credits. That was the pot, enough to fuel his ship, the Wayfarer's debt, for a month, or enough to drink himself into a coma for a week. Cale pushed a stack of chips forward. His hands were steady. They were always steady. It was the rest of him that felt like it was vibrating apart. Call, the dealer grunted. He was a Tellarite with a cybernetic jaw that clicked when he spoke. Cale turned over his cards. A losing hand. He had known it was a losing hand before he bet. He didn't care. Losing felt right. Losing felt like equilibrium. He stood up, ignoring the jeers of the other players as they raked in his credits. He needed air, or at least the station's poor imitation of it. He pushed through the magnetic bead curtain and stumbled out into the promenade. The station was a sensory assault. Neon signs in a dozen languages flickered overhead, advertising everything from illegal gene mods to indentured servants. The noise was a physical weight, the roar of thrusters from the docking ring, the thumping bass of a nearby brothel, the shout of vendors hawking salvage. Kyle leaned against a rusted bulkhead, closing his eyes. Green. The memory hit him without permission. It always did. He was strapped into the cockpit of a Wraith-class strike fighter. The silence of space was deafening. Below him spun Erythra, a jewel of a world, emerald forests and sapphire oceans wrapped in wisps of white cloud. It was beautiful. It was alive. Target locked, Riven 3. A voice crackled in his ear. Command authorization Alpha 09. Burn it. I have civilian readings, Kyle said. His younger voice sounded calm, professional, detached, just like they trained him. Those are insurgents. Proceed with the glassing protocols. That is an order. Lieutenant, he squeezed the trigger. He did not hesitate. He was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. The atmosphere ignited. It didn't burn like a fire, it burned like a chemical reaction. The clouds turned to plasma. The green forests blackened and then vanished under a sheet of molten light. The oceans boiled. In 6 seconds, the jewel was gone. In its place was a smooth, glowing marble of glass and ash. Cale snapped his eyes open, gasping for breath. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He shoved himself off the bulkhead, needing to move, needing to outrun the ghost of the world he had murdered. He walked without destination, letting the flow of the crowd carry him. He drifted toward the lower levels, where the air was thicker and the lights were dimmer. This was the flesh market. Here, sentient beings were bought and sold like cattle. Kyle told himself he didn't care. He had seen worse. He had done worse. He walked past rows of cages, a Rhodian mechanic chained to a workbench, a pair of Twi'lek dancers huddled together for warmth. He kept his face blank, a mask of cynical indifference. He was just a pilot looking for a job. He was nobody. But he flinched every time a neural collar sparked, sending a jolt of pain through a slave who moved too slowly. Kyle's hand twitched toward the blaster holstered at his hip. He forced his fingers to uncurl. You can't save them, he told himself. You can't even save yourself. Laughter erupted from the main auction stage ahead. It was a cruel braying sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd. Kyle meant to turn away. He meant to head back to the docking bay, sleep off the liquor, and find a cargo run in the morning. But the laughter pulled at him. It sounded like the laughter of the men who had given the order to burn Erythra. He pushed through the throng of buyers, mercenaries, warlords, crime syndicate lieutenants, until he reached the edge of the pit. The stage was illuminated by harsh white floodlights. In the center stood a transparent energy cage, humming with high-voltage containment fields. Inside the cage was a girl. She was tall, painfully thin, her collarbones sharp against her skin, but it was her skin that held the crowd's attention. It was a pale, iridescent violet, marked with bioluminescent patterns that glowed softly in the gloom. Swirls and geometric lines that looked like constellations mapped onto her flesh. They traced the line of her throat, curled around her temples, and vanished beneath the torn remnants of what had once been intricate ceremonial silks. She stood with her back straight, her chin lifted high. Her hands were bound in heavy magnetic shackles, but she did not look like a prisoner. She looked like a queen waiting for her subjects to stop behaving like animals. The auctioneer, a corpulent human with a greasy smile and a microphone implanted in his throat, slapped the side of the energy cage with a cane. "Look at this, gentlemen," he boomed. "We do not get stock like this every rotation. Royal cargo, a genuine high-caste scion from a dead world." The girl did not flinch. She stared out at the sea of faces with eyes that were entirely black. No whites, no irises, just deep, endless voids. They were cold, assessing. Cale felt a chill crawl up his spine. She wasn't terrified. She was furious. Her family didn't pay the ransom. The auctioneer sneered. Probably because they are all dead. Or maybe they just realized she was too much trouble. He pressed a button on a remote. The silver collar clamped around the girl's slender neck flared with red light. A neural shock hit her. Her breath hitched, her knees buckled. But she caught herself. She refused to fall. She locked her jaw, her bioluminescent markings flaring brighter for a second, pulsing with her pain, before settling back to a dim glow. Kyle watched her hands. They were trembling, a fine, violent tremor that she was fighting with every ounce of her will. "She needs discipline," a voice near Cale said. Cale glanced to his left. Two slavers were watching the stage, grinning. One of them, a scarred Batarian, licked his lips. "I'll buy her for the mines," the other one said. "Or maybe for the crew. She looks like she breaks pretty." Cale's stomach twisted. It was a physical sensation, like a fist clenching in his gut, disgust, and something else. Something sharp and hot that felt dangerously like purpose. He looked back at the girl. She was scanning the crowd, and for a heartbeat, her black eyes met his. There was no plea in them, no begging. She looked at him and through him, judging him, finding him wanting. She looked like she expected to die on this stage, and she intended to die standing up. "Bidding starts at 5,000 credits, the auctioneer shouted. "Do I hear 5? 5! The Batarian next to Cale shouted. 6! A voice from the back called out. 7! The price climbed. The slavers were hungry. They smelled blood. Cale's hand hovered over his belt. He had 400 credits left in his account. He was destitute. He was a drunk. He was a war criminal hiding in the ass end of the galaxy. He watched the girl's collar spark again as she shifted her weight. She closed her eyes for a second, and a single tear leaked out. It glowed. The tear itself was luminescent, trailing a line of light down her cheek before she angrily brushed it away against her shoulder. That light. It looked like the atmosphere of Erythra before it burned. 8,000, the Batarian yelled. Going once at 8,000, the auctioneer crowed, to the gentleman with the ambitious crew. Cale didn't think. If he had thought, he would have walked away. 10,000? Cale said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The circle of men around him fell silent. The auctioneer peered into the gloom. 10,000? Do you have the liquidity, friend? You look like you couldn't afford a drink of water. Cale stepped into the light. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a data chip. It was old, scarred, and encased in heavy plastic. I don't have credits, Cale said, his voice rasping. I have a deed, a modified heavy gunship. Class 4 hyperdrive, military-grade shielding. It's sitting in docking bay 94. The crowd murmured. A ship like that was worth 50,000. Easy. Even stripped for parts, it was worth 20. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed. He motioned to a subordinate, who hurried over with a scanner. Cale handed over the chip. The scanner beeped. It is legitimate, the subordinate whispered. The auctioneer grinned. A ship, a whole ship for one girl. You must be lonely. Spacer. 12,000, the Batarian snarled, stepping forward. My ship is worth 50, Cale said, not looking at the slaver. He kept his eyes on the girl. I am betting the ship, all of it, against anyone who wants to top that. Silence descended on the hall. Nobody was going to bid 50,000 credits for a single slave, not even a royal one. The economics didn't make sense. The Batarian cursed and spat on the floor, backing down. The auctioneer clapped his hands together, a wet, smacking sound, sold, to the man with the death wish. The energy cage hissed and powered down. The field vanished. Cale stood there, his heart pounding in his ears. He felt sick. He had just traded his home, his livelihood, his only means of escape, for a stranger. He was insane. He was absolutely insane. He walked toward the stage. The crowd parted for him, eyeing him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. As Cale climbed the steps, the auctioneer leaned into his microphone, his voice booming through the hall, thick with amusement. Ladies and gentlemen, look at the irony. He thinks he is a hero. He bought the alien princess's freedom, not knowing she was the daughter of the world he burned. The crowd laughed. They thought it was a joke, a bit of hyperbole to spice up the sale. The world he burned, a figure of speech. But inside the cage, Saris went still. She had been looking at Cale with wariness. Now, her head snapped up. Her black eyes widened. The bioluminescence along her neck flared blindingly bright. A sudden pulse of distress that lit up the stage. She stared at him. Really stared at him. She looked at the set of his shoulders. The military cut of his jacket. The way he walked. She saw the ghost of the officer he used to be. Panic flashed in her expression. Real, primal terror. She took a step back, pressing herself against the rear bars of the cage. Cale ignored the auctioneer's words. He refused to process them. He stepped onto the platform and reached for the control pad on her shackles. You are not a slave anymore, Cale snapped. He tried to sound noble. He wanted to sound like the hero the auctioneer mocked. But his voice cracked. He sounded angry. He sounded like a man who hated himself for what he was doing. He keyed the release code the auctioneer had transferred to his data pad. The magnetic cuffs disengaged with a heavy clank and fell to the metal deck. Saris rubbed her wrists. Her skin was raw where the metal had bitten in. She didn't run. She didn't say thank you. She looked up at him, her face composed into a mask of icy hatred. You bought a body in a cage, she said. Her voice was melodic, but sharp as a glass shard. She spoke perfect trade common, the language of the merchants and the fleet. Don't call it freedom yet. Cale flinched. Let's Let's go, he muttered. Before I change my mind. He grabbed her arm to guide her off the stage. Her skin was cool to the touch, but beneath the surface, it felt like touching a live wire. A faint hum of energy vibrated against his fingertips. She wrenched her arm away. "Do not touch me," she hissed. "I'm getting you out of here," Kyle said through gritted teeth. "Walk!" He marched her through the jeering crowd, his hand hovering near his blaster. He felt the eyes of the station boss's men on him. He had signed over the deed. The ship wasn't his anymore. He had nowhere to take her. He led her into the cramped administrative office behind the auction block. It was a filthy room filled with stacks of cargo manifests and the smell of stale smoke. "Turn around," Kyle ordered. Saris hesitated, then turned her back to him. She swept her dark hair away from her neck, revealing the neural collar. It was locked tight against her spine, the control node pulsing with a steady red rhythm. Kyle examined it. It was a chaotic mess of wiring and proprietary tech. If he tried to pry it off, it would fry her brainstem. "I can't get this off," Kyle said, frustration leaking into his voice. "Not without tools I don't have." "Then I am still property," Saris said to the wall. "I have the key fob," Kyle said. "I can turn off the pain compliance, but the tracker and the kill switch are hardwired." He tapped the code into the fob. The red light on the collar turned amber. The low-level hum that had been making her muscles twitch ceased. Saris let out a long, shuddering breath. Her shoulders slumped for a fraction of a second before she forced them straight again. Kyle reached out to check the seal on the collar. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck. Static snapped between them. It wasn't just electricity, it was a psychic jolt. A sudden flash of white noise that made Kale's vision blur. He jerked his hand back. Saris gasped and spun around, pressing her back against the filing cabinets. They stared at each other in the cramped silence. The air between them felt thick, charged with a strange, terrifying gravity. It was fear. Yes. But beneath the fear was an involuntary, biological recognition. A pull. She was beautiful, even in rags, even with the dirt of the cage on her face. She was the most striking thing he had ever seen, and she was terrified of him. "Why did you do it?" she demanded. Her voice shook, just a little. "You are human. You are a soldier gone by me." "I'm not a soldier," Kale said. "I'm not anymore. You walk like one. You kill like one." Kale looked away. I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't like his face. He didn't tell her the truth. He didn't tell her that when he looked at her. He saw the green world he had destroyed. He didn't tell her that buying her felt like paying a debt that could never be fully paid. "We need to move," Kyle said. They left the office and navigated the labyrinthine corridors toward the docking bays. The silence between them was combative. "Where are we going?" Saris asked. "If you intend to sell me to another, do it quickly. I tire of walking." "I'm not selling you," Kale said. "Stop talking. You have a hero complex," she said. It was a sneer. "You think purchasing me washes the blood off your hands? It does not. It just smears it." "Shut up," Kale snapped. "I do not owe you gratitude," she pressed. "I do not owe you obedience. I don't want your gratitude," Kale shouted, spinning on her. People in the corridor stopped to stare. He lowered his voice, stepping into her personal space. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to get you off this rock before they decide to resell you." Saris looked up at him. She was tall for a human, but he still towered over her. She didn't back down. She tilted her chin up, exposing the collar. "Then let me go," she challenged. "Leave me here. You'd be dead in an hour," Kyle said, "or worse." They reached Docking Bay 94. The Wayfarer's debt sat on the pad. It was an ugly ship, A modified gunship from the war that had been stripped of its missile racks and retrofitted with cargo holds. It was scarred, patched with unpainted hull plating, and leaking hydraulic fluid. But it was his. Or it had been. Standing at the airlock ramp was a massive figure flanked by 2 security drones. It was Vala, the station boss. She was a cybernetically enhanced matriarch who ran Black Fall Spindle with an iron fist and a ledger of debts. She held Kale's data chip in her metallic hand. Going somewhere. Riven? Vala asked. Her voice was a synthesized deep bass. Kyle stopped. He put a hand out to stop Saris, shielding her with his body. I need the ship, Vala, Kale said. It is my ship, Vala said. You signed it over. A fair trade. 1 princess, 1 gunship. I can't fly her out of here on my back, Kale said. Vala looked at Saris, her ocular implants whirred, zooming in, scanning the girl's bone structure, her markings, the collar. Saris Valen, Vala murmured. Erythran royalty. Presumed dead. Saris went rigid. How do you know that name? Vala ignored her. She looked back at Kale. You have made a very interesting purchase. Riven, there are people looking for this asset. Powerful people. I don't care, Kyle said. I want my ship back. Vala tapped the chip against her chin. I am a businesswoman. The ship is yours. Legally speaking, but physically, it is still in my bay. I will make you a deal. I'm listening. You keep the ship. You take the girl. But you owe me. Kyle narrowed his eyes. What do I owe you? 1 run, Vala said. High risk, no questions. When I call, you answer, and you give me the deed chip back until the job is done. Kale hesitated. He was signing his life away. Again. Fine, Kale said. Give me the access codes. Vala threw him a temporary access stick. He caught it out of the air. Do not disappoint me. Riven, Vala said. As Kale hustled Saris up the ramp, Vala touched the side of her head, activating a secure comms link. She watched them disappear into the ship. Asset located, Vala said quietly into the comms. She is with the pilot Riven. They are leaving Blackfall now, sending transponder codes. Kale hit the airlock cycle button. The heavy door hissed shut, sealing out the noise of the station. The interior of the Wayfarer was dim and smelled of old coffee and engine grease. It was cramped, utilitarian, and messy. Strap in, Kale ordered, pointing to the co-pilot's seat. Saris looked around the cockpit with disdain. She ran a finger over the worn leather of the chair. It smells like failure in here, she said. It's about to smell like vacuum if you don't sit down, Kale retorted. He threw himself into the pilot's seat and began flipping switches. The reactor groaned to life. The deck plates vibrated. He felt the familiar comfort of the controls. This was the only place he made sense, in the sky. He punched in the launch sequence. The docking clamps released with a dull thud. The Wayfarer blasted out of the hangar bay, engines flaring blue. Kale pushed the throttle forward, burning hard for the jump point. He wanted to put as many light years between him and Blackfall as possible. As the ship cleared the station's gravity well, a small metallic device detached from a drone hovering near the hull and latched onto the Wayfarer's exhaust port. It was a limpet tracker, small and silent. Inside the cockpit, the stars stretched into lines of infinite light as the hyperdrive engaged. The sudden acceleration pressed them back into their seats. Then, silence. The mottled blue and violet tunnel of FTL travel swirled outside the transparasteel canopy. Kyle exhaled, the adrenaline crashing out of his system. He unbuckled his harness and spun his chair around. Saris was sitting rigid in her seat. The collar was glowing faintly in the dim light of the cockpit. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking out at the impossible colors of hyperspace. "You're safe," Kyle said. He realized he didn't know what else to say. "Safe," she repeated. She tested the word like it was a foreign coin. "I can drop you anywhere," Kale said. "The rim, the core worlds. You tell me where to go." Saris finally turned her head. Her face was illuminated by the dashboard lights, amber and soft blue. Her expression was hollow. "My home isn't on any map anymore," she said quietly. The words hit Kale like a physical blow. He knew. God, he knew. He stood up abruptly. "I need a drink." He fled the cockpit. He couldn't be near her. The guilt was suffocating. He went to his quarters, a tiny bunk room that was little more than a closet. He grabbed a bottle of cheap synth whiskey from under his pillow and took a long pull. It burned, but it didn't burn enough. He sat on the edge of his bunk. On the wall, taped up with peeling adhesive, were his mementos, a faded photo of his old squadron, a unit insignia, the Screaming Eagles, and next to it, a black mission patch. It had no image, just a date and a name in red letters, Erythra. It was classified. Nobody was supposed to have it. It was the badge of shame he kept to remind himself of what he was. He stared at it. He traced the letters with his eyes. He had burned her world. He had pulled the trigger that killed her family, her people, her history. And now she was sitting in his cockpit. He had bought her freedom. What a sick joke. Kale put his head in his hands. In the corridor outside, Sarah stood in the shadows. She had followed him. She had seen him staring at the patch. She didn't know what the patch meant, not yet. But she felt the darkness in him. She felt the weight of his memories radiating off him like heat. She leaned her head back against the metal bulkhead. Her eyes closed. The bioluminescent markings on her temples flared, flickering in the dark like a dying heartbeat. She whispered into the silence, the words sharp and guttural in her native tongue, a language that was supposed to be extinct. "I will find them," she vowed. "I will find the ones who lit the fire, and I will burn them until there is nothing left but ash." The wayfarer hurtled through the dark, carrying a ghost and a monster, bound together by a secret that was waiting to destroy them both. The hyperspace tunnel outside the viewport was a swirling vortex of violet and bruised indigo, a hypnotic blur that usually lulled Kale Riven to sleep. Today, however, the silence inside the wayfarer's det was louder than the screaming engines. Morning in the galley was an exercise in tension. The air recycler was humming a low, rattling note that Kale had been meaning to fix for 6 months, and the smell of burnt coffee hung heavy in the small metal room. Kale stood by the fabricator, watching a gray, gelatinous blob extrude into a bowl. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of 2 days of stubble. He felt hungover, though he hadn't touched a drop since they left Blackfall's spindle. The hangover was spiritual. He turned around, holding 2 bowls of the nutrient paste and 2 mugs of black coffee that looked like engine oil. "Breakfast," Kyle announced, his voice rough. Saris Valen sat at the small, bolted-down table. She was still wearing the rags from the auction block, though she had tried to clean them. She sat with a posture that made the battered aluminum chair look like a throne. Her bioluminescent markings were dim, pulsing with a slow, wary rhythm. She looked at the bowl Kale set down in front of her. She did not touch it. "Is this punishment?" she asked. "It is protein, carbohydrates, and essential vitamins," Kale said, sliding into the seat opposite her. "It tastes like wet cardboard, but it keeps you alive." Saris picked up a spoon, inspecting it as if it were a rusted surgical tool. She took a microscopic bite, her nose wrinkled, a very human expression on her luminous face. "Your species conquered half the sector," she said, swallowing with difficulty. "And yet you have not conquered the concept of flavor. We focus on efficiency." Kyle grunted, shoveling a spoonful of the gray sludge into his mouth. He ignored the taste. He had eaten worse in the trenches of chaotic moons. Saris took a sip of the coffee and visibly shuddered. "And this? Is this solvent?" "Fuel," Kyle said. "Drink it. We have a long day ahead." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Every time Kyle looked up, he caught her watching him. Her eyes were dark voids, unreadable, scanning his hands, his face, the way he held his spoon. She was waiting for him to snap. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Where are we going?" she asked again. "I told you," Kyle said. "Arnax Drift. It is a trade hub in the asteroid belt. No questions asked, no ID scans. And what happens there?" "We get that collar off your neck," Kale said, gesturing with his spoon toward the metal band choking her throat. "And we get you some clothes that don't look like you just escaped a war zone." Saris touched the collar reflexively. Her fingers were long and slender, the nails chipped. "And then," she pressed. "And then we figure it out," Kale said. He stood up to clear his bowl, unable to handle the scrutiny of those black eyes. He felt like a fraud. He was playing the savior, but every time he looked at her, he saw the firestorm he had unleashed on her world. For the next 3 hours, while Kyle ran diagnostics in the cockpit, Saris explored the ship. She moved like a ghost. Kyle watched her on the internal security monitors. She didn't stomp or march. She glided. She touched everything. She ran her fingertips along the scarred metal bulkheads, tracing the weld lines where the ship had been patched together after firefights. She paused at the entertainment console in the lounge. It was an ancient unit, loaded with terrestrial rock and blues from 3 centuries ago. She tapped a button, and a gravelly voice began to sing about dusty roads and broken hearts. She tilted her head, listening for a moment, then turned it off with a scoff. "So loud," she muttered to the empty room. "So chaotic." She moved into Kale's small office, a nook off the main corridor. Kyle stiffened in the pilot's chair as he watched her pick up a data pad, then put it down. She picked up a physical paper book, a rarity, and flipped through the pages before discarding it. Then she saw the photo. It was a cracked holographic frame stuck to the bulkhead with magnetic tape. It showed a younger Kale, 10 years ago, standing with his arm around a woman who was laughing, her hair blowing across her face. Beside them was a golden retriever. Saris stared at the image. She leaned in close, her breath fogging the small display. "Primitive," she whispered. She wasn't talking about the technology. She was talking about the happiness. She looked at the smile on Kale's younger face with a mixture of confusion and disdain, as if the concept of joy was a childish affectation he should have outgrown. Kale switched off the monitor. He didn't want to see her looking at the man he used to be. Arnax Drift was not a planet. It was a massive, hollowed-out asteroid spinning lazily in the dark, tethered to a dozen smaller rocks by thick durasteel cables. It looked like a cancerous growth on the face of space, glittering with the lights of 1,000 shanty towns built into the rock. Kale guided the wayfarer into a docking cradle that smelled of sulfur and burning ozone. "Hood up," Kale said, tossing her a heavy gray cloak he had dug out of storage. "Keep your head down. Don't look anyone in the eye." Saris caught the cloak and draped it over her shoulders, pulling the hood deep to shadow her face. It hid her glowing markings, but it couldn't hide the way she carried herself, tall, regal, and dangerous. They disembarked into the chaos of the market. The air here was thin and cold, Recycling systems pushed to their limit by the crush of bodies. It was a sensory assault. Merchants shouted in 50 languages, drones buzzed overhead carrying crates of contraband. The smell of frying meat and exhaust fumes was thick enough to chew. Kyle moved with the ease of a man used to dangerous places. He kept a hand near his hip, steering Saris through the throng with subtle nudges to her elbow. She flinched every time he touched her. "We need credits," Saris hissed, leaning close to him so she wouldn't be overheard. "You spent everything on me. I have a stash," Kale lied. He had 200 credits left on a secondary chit, and he was praying the mechanic he knew was feeling charitable. First stop was a clothing stall run by a four-armed alien with skin like bark. Racks of garments hung from the ceiling, scavenged flight suits, neon clubwear, heavy mining gear. "Get something practical," Kale said, standing guard at the entrance. "Boots, pants, something you can run in." Saris moved through the racks. She stopped in front of a display of silk tunics, bright, translucent, designed for harem dancers and high-end escorts. She stared at them, her hand trembling as she reached out. Kale stepped in. "No, not those." Saris whirled on him, her eyes blazing beneath her hood. "I do not need your fashion advice. Pilot." "Those are target markers," Kale said, his voice low. "You wear that, and every slaver in this drift will know exactly what you are. You need to blend in." "I will not wear rags," Saris snapped, her voice rising. "I have worn rags for 6 months. I have been dragged through mud and filth. I was." She stopped, choking on the title she could no longer claim. "You were a princess," Kale finished quietly. "I know, but right now you are a fugitive. Pick the cargo pants." They stared at each other, breathless with frustration. The air between them crackled. It wasn't just anger, it was the friction of two people trapped in a pressure cooker. Kale looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the pride she was using to hold herself together. "Fine," she spat. She grabbed a pair of heavy synth-weave trousers and a thick tunic. She sat on a crate to try on the boots, and they were human military surplus, heavy and clunky. She jammed her foot in, scowling. She stood up, took one step, and the heavy sole caught on the uneven metal grating of the floor. She pitched forward. Kyle moved before he thought. He lunged, catching her by the waist, one hand splayed across her back, the other gripping her arm to steady her. She slammed into his chest. For a second, they were frozen. The market noise faded into a dull roar. Kyle could feel the heat of her body through the thin fabric of her auction rags. He could smell her scent, something like ozone and crushed flowers, alien and intoxicating. He looked down, and her hood had fallen back. Her face was inches from his. Her eyes were wide, the black depths suddenly filled with panic and something else. Her hands were clutching the lapels of his leather jacket, gripping him tightly. She was heavy in his arms, solid and real. His heart hammered against his ribs, a traitorous rhythm. He saw her gaze drop to his mouth, then snap back up to his eyes. "Human gravity," Saris breathed, her voice shaky. "It is unreasonably clingy." She shoved him away. Kyle stumbled back a step, clearing his throat, his face heating up. "Yeah, gravity. Keep the boots. They fit." He turned away quickly, paying the merchant with hands that weren't quite steady. The tech den was located in the bowels of the asteroid, down a corridor that flickered with dying fluorescent lights. It was run by a Solarian named Morden, a nervous, twitchy creature with oversized eyes and hands that moved too fast. "This is illegal," Morden said, his voice high and fast. "Very illegal. Collar is high grade. Military spec. Look here." He pointed a long, bony finger at the diagnostic screen. Saris was kneeling on a mat in the center of the room, the collar hooked up to a tangle of wires. Kale stood behind her, his arms crossed. "See the red line?" Morden chattered. "That is a heartbeat sensor linked to a remote kill switch. If I cut the circuit, it sends a signal. Boom. Neural shock, maybe brain death, maybe just drooling vegetable." "Can you bypass it?" Kale asked. "Maybe. 50-50. Whoever put this on her wanted to make sure she did not leave." "Do it," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, terrifyingly so. "It could kill you," Kale said. "Living like this is not living," Sarah said, staring straight ahead. "Cut it off, or I will tear it off myself." Kale looked at the Solarian. "Do it." Morden nodded, pulling down a pair of magnifying goggles. "Hold her still. If she moves 1 millimeter while I am cutting the neural link, the fail-safe triggers." Kale stepped up behind Saris. He hesitated, then placed his hands on her shoulders. She went rigid. "I have to hold you," Kyle murmured. "Don't move." Saris nodded once, barely visible. Kyle gripped her shoulders firmly. He felt the tension in her muscles, coiled tight as steel cables. He knelt behind her, his chest almost touching her back. He could feel the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. "Ready?" Morden said. He lowered a laser cutter that whined with a high-pitched frequency. The laser touched the metal band. Smoke curled up, smelling of burnt ozone and hair. Saris let out a small, strangled sound. "Easy," Kale whispered, leaning closer, his mouth near her ear. "I've got you, just breathe." The laser cut deeper. The collar began to hum, an angry, vibrating sound that resonated through Saris's body and into Kale's hands. "Warning!" Morden yelped. "Energy spike!" Pain slammed into Saris. It wasn't just physical. It was a psychic backlash, a white-hot needle driven into her mind. She screamed, her head thrashing back. Kale clamped his hands tighter, using his weight to pin her in place. "Don't move!" The pain tore through her shields. Saris couldn't control it. Her latent power, suppressed by the collar for months, found a crack and erupted. A shockwave of violet energy blasted outward from her body. Tools flew off the shelves. The diagnostic screen shattered in a shower of sparks. The lights in the room blew out, plunging them into darkness lit only by the angry sparking of the collar and the blazing light of Saris's markings. Kale was thrown backward, but he refused to let go. He slid across the floor, dragging her with him, wrapping his arms around her chest to keep her from thrashing. "It's okay," Kale shouted over the sound of arcing electricity. "It's almost through." Morden, terrified but professional, lunged forward in the strobe light chaos and severed the final wire with a pair of manual snips. Snap! The hum died instantly. The collar clicked open and fell from her neck, clattering to the floor, smoking. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and ringing. Saris gasped. It was a huge, desperate intake of air, like a diver breaking the surface. The crushing weight that had been sitting on her mind for months was gone. She slumped back against Kale, exhausted. Kale held her. He didn't mean to linger, but the adrenaline had him frozen. He had one arm across her chest, the other gripping her shoulder. He could feel her heart racing against his forearm. She was sweating, shivering violently. For a moment, in the dark, with the smell of smoke around them, it felt intimate. Dangerously so. He felt a fierce protectiveness well up in him, a desire to wrap himself around her and shield her from the entire galaxy. Saris's senses were returning, heightened and raw. She could feel everything, the cold floor, the throbbing ache in her neck, and the heat, the overwhelming solid heat of the human male holding her. It was too much. The safety felt like a trap. She scrambled away from him, scuttling across the floor until her back hit the wall. Her chest heaved. "Don't!" she gasped. Kyle held up his hands, palms open. I'm not hurting you. It's off. You're free. Saris touched her neck. The skin was raw and tender, but the metal was gone. She looked at the smoking collar on the floor, then up at Kyle. Her eyes were wide, feral. Do not touch me like you own me, she snapped. The words hung in the air. Kyle looked at her, his expression shifting from concern to a guarded mask. He lowered his hands. I was keeping you from frying your brain, Your Highness, Kale said, his voice dropping into a defensive sarcasm. Next time, I'll just let you twitch. He stood up and tossed a credit chip to the shaking Solarian. Let's go, Kale said coldly, before you blow up the rest of the station. The return trip to the ship was silent. The tension from the market had curdled into something darker. Night cycle on the Wayfarer was artificial. The lights dimmed to a low amber, the hum of the engine dropping to a lower frequency. Kale sat in his quarters, staring at the datapad he had stolen from the slaver's office back on Blackfall. He had finally cracked the encryption while Saris was in the refresher. He shouldn't have looked. Ignorance was bliss. He heard a knock on his door. It was faint, hesitant. Yeah? Kale called out. The door slid open. Saris stood there. She had showered and changed into the clothes they bought, the dark cargo pants and a gray tunic. She looked cleaner, stronger. Her hair was damp, but her face was blank. It was the face of the girl in the cage. Can I come in? She asked. Kale sat up, turning off the datapad. It's your ship as much as mine right now. What do you need? Saris stepped inside and the door slid shut behind her. The room was tiny, dominated by the bunk and the desk. She stood by the door, hands clasped behind her back. I have been thinking, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the fire she had shown earlier. About what? About debt, she said. You spent everything you had. You risked your life. You removed the collar, I told you, Kale said, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't want gratitude. I know, Saris said. Gratitude is for equals. We are not equals. You are the master. I am the acquisition. Kyle frowned. Stop saying that. You're not a slave. Saris stepped forward. She began to unbuckle the belt of her new trousers. Kyle froze. What are you doing? I have no credits, Saris said. She pulled the tunic over her head. Beneath it, she wore a simple tank top that left her arms and collarbones bare. Her markings glowed softly in the dim light. I have no information you can sell. I have no skills that are useful on a ship like this. She looked him in the eye, her gaze dead. But I was raised in the courts. I know how to please men. It was part of my education in case I needed to secure an alliance. She reached for the hem of the tank top. I will repay you, she said. This way. The ledger is balanced. You will never be able to say I cost you too much. Kale was on his feet in a second. Stop, he shouted. Saris flinched, her hands freezing on the fabric. She looked confused. Is this not what you want? You held me today. I felt you. Kale crossed the small distance between them, but he didn't touch her. He stopped a foot away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, trembling with rage. Not at her. At the universe that had taught her this. Put your clothes on, Kale said, his voice shaking. Saris stared at him. You are refusing? Yes, I am refusing. Kale raked a hand through his hair, pacing the small room. God, Saris, look at me. She watched him, wary. I didn't buy you for that, Kyle said, gesturing vaguely at the bed. I bought you because seeing you in that cage made me sick. I bought you because it was the only decent thing I've done in 10 years. Saris lowered her hands. But you want me, she stated. It was not a question. Kyle stopped pacing. He looked at her. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "Yes," he admitted, his voice rough. "I want you. You are beautiful, and I am a man, and I'm not blind. But wanting you isn't the same as taking you." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Your body is not currency here. It is not a debt. It is yours. Do you understand? If you ever come to my bed, it will be because you want to be there, not because you think you owe me rent." Sarah stared at him. The cold mask she wore began to crack. Her lips parted. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. She felt a wave of heat rush up her neck, not from passion, but from a crushing, burning humiliation. She had misread him. She had debased herself, offered herself up like a piece of meat, and he had rejected the offer with a morality she didn't think humans possessed. She began to tremble. Tears, hot and glowing, welled up in her eyes. I thought..." She stammered. "I know what you thought," Cale said gently. He reached out, as if to touch her shoulder, then stopped himself. He pulled his hand back. "Go to bed, Saris. Lock your door if it makes you feel safer. But you don't need to fear me." They stood there in the doorway. The sexual tension was still there, thick and heavy. The undeniable pull of two damaged people standing too close in the dark. Kyle could smell her damp hair. He could see the pulse in her throat. He wanted to pull her in. He wanted to kiss the confusion off her face. But he stepped back. He sat down on his bunk and turned away. "Good night, Saris." Saris stood there for another heartbeat, her breathing ragged. Then she turned and fled the room. Saris did not sleep. She spent the night in the observation dome, a small blister of transparent steel on the ship's upper hull. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. Outside, the stars were streaks of white fire. A nebula burned in the distance, a bruise of orange and red against the void. She felt unmoored, everything she knew about the universe, that the strong took what they wanted, that the weak survived by submission, had been upended by a cynicism-soaked pilot with sad eyes. He had burned her world. She knew a human squadron had done it. She hated them all. And yet, his hands had been gentle. His voice had trembled when he told her she was free. She closed her eyes, letting her forehead rest against the glass. The conflict inside her was a physical ache. She hated him for being human. She hated herself for wanting to trust him. In his quarters, Cale was not sleeping either. He had the data pad active again. The blue light illuminated his tired face. He was reading the decrypted files from the slaver's drive. It was a list of high-value targets, bounties, and there, at the top of the list, flagged with a crimson priority marker, Target, Asset 9 Alpha. Identity, Velen, Saris, Royal Scion. Status, terminate on sight. Issued by Terran Coalition High Command. Cale felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just a slaver looking for a lost prize. This was a military directive. The same people who had ordered the glassing of Erythra were hunting her. They hadn't just wanted the planet dead. They wanted the lineage erased. If he told her, she would run. She would try to fight them alone. And she would die. Kyle switched off the pad. He sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the ship. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. He had to get her somewhere safe. He had to be her shield, even if she hated him for it. Sector 7, Coalition Flagship. The Vengeance Admiral Darius Holt stood on the bridge, looking out at the fleet assembly. He was a man of sharp angles and polished silver, his uniform immaculate. A communications officer approached, holding a data pad. "Report from Blackfall Spindle, sir. The deep cover asset." Holt took the pad. He scanned the text. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "She is alive," Holt whispered. "And she is traveling with a pilot. the officer added. A freelancer named Riven. Riven, Holt repeated. The name was familiar. He accessed the personnel archives in his mind. Ah, the hero of Erythra. The irony was delicious. Let them run, Holt said, handing the pad back. It makes the hunt more interesting. Send the coordinates to the tracker teams, and tell them I want the girl's body identifiable, the pilot. They can burn. Rook's Hollow was not a place where people went to be found. It was a jagged scar of a colony dug deep into the bedrock of a rogue moon, illuminated by the sickly yellow glow of sulfur lamps and the neon flicker of subterranean dive bars. The air scrubbers here had been failing for 20 years, leaving a permanent haze of industrial smog that tasted like copper and regret. Cale Riven set the Wayfarer's debt down on a landing pad that was more rust than metal. The ship groaned as the hydraulics hissed, settling its weight onto the uneven surface. Stay here, Cale said, unbuckling his harness and reaching for the heavy blaster pistol under the console. I mean it. Ceres. This isn't a trade station. It is a hole. Ceres Valen was already standing, checking the mag seal on her boots. She had pulled her hair back into a severe knot, exposing the sharp, elegant lines of her jaw. Her bioluminescent markings were dimmed to a faint, barely visible pulse. I am not luggage. Cale, she said, her voice cool and brook clear. I do not sit in the cargo hold while you conduct business. It is dangerous, Cale countered, sliding the blaster into his hip holster. You are dangerous, Ceres replied, meeting his eyes. And I am still here. Besides, if the people hunting me have tracked the ship, I am a sitting duck if I stay inside. I am safer with the gun. She pointed a slender finger at his hip. Cale stared at her. He wanted to argue. He wanted to lock her in the cabin where the world couldn't touch her. But the past 2 days of travel had taught him that Ceres Valen did not bend. She might break, but she did not bend. Fine, Cale grunted. But you stay close. If I say run, you run. You don't ask why. You don't look back. You just move. I know how to run, she said softly. It is the only thing I have done for 6 months. They descended the ramp into the smog. The noise of Rook's Hollow hit them instantly. The grind of mining drills, the thumping bass of music from the lower levels, the shouting of hawkers selling filtered water and black market organs. They moved through the crowded streets. Kyle took the lead. His shoulders hunched against the crowd, carving a path. Ceres moved in his wake, but she didn't cower. She walked with a predator's grace, her eyes scanning the rooftops, the shadows, the faces of the passers-by. Kyle noticed it immediately. They were in sync. When he shifted left to avoid a staggering drunk, she shifted right to cover his blind spot. When he paused to check a street sign, she stopped with her back to a wall, watching the rear. It wasn't planned. It was instinct. It was the unconscious rhythm of two people who had recognized the violence in each other and found it familiar. They reached a heavy blast door at the end of a blind alley. A camera swiveled down, its lens focusing with a mechanical whir. Riven, a distorted voice crackled from a speaker box. You look like hell. Open the door. Jax, Cale said. The bolt slammed back and the door hissed open. The room beyond was a chaotic nest of hardware. Monitors covered every inch of the walls, scrolling through streams of encrypted code, news feeds, and surveillance footage from a dozen systems. In the center of the room sat Jax Marin, suspended in a hover chair. He was half man, half salvage. His legs were gone, replaced by the chair's anti-grav repulsors, and his left eye was a glowing red optic sensor that zoomed in and out as they entered. Well, Jax grinned. Spinning the chair around, the ghost returns. And he brought a friend. Jax's mechanical eye whirred as it fixed on Saris. He looked her up and down with a lecherous grin that didn't quite reach his human eye. Nice, Jax whistled. Very nice. I didn't think you had it in you. Kale. Finally got yourself a companion? How much did she cost by the hour? Saris stiffened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She looked at Jax with the kind of icy disdain that could freeze nitrogen. I am not a companion, Saris said, her voice razor-sharp. And if you look at me like that again, I will dismantle that chair while you are still sitting in it. Jax blinked, surprised, feisty. I like it. Show her respect. Jax, Kale snapped. His voice was low, but it carried a threat that made Jax's smile vanish. She is with me. She is not part of the joke. Jax looked from Kale to Saris, reading the tension, the protective stance Kale had taken. He raised his hands in surrender. All right, touchy. Relax, Riven. Jax spun back to his console. So, why are you here? You didn't come to Rook's Hollow for the ambiance. I need intel, Kale said, stepping up to the main desk. He pulled the encrypted drive from his pocket, the one he had taken from Blackfall. I have a trace on a bounty hunter signal. High-level encryption. I need to know who is sending it and who is paying for it. Jax took the chip and slotted it into a reader. His fingers flew across a holographic keyboard. While the men worked, Saris stepped away. She felt suffocated by the walls of screens, by the casual way these men discussed danger. She wandered toward a side room, separated from the main den by a bead curtain. It was a storage archive. Dust motes danced in the light of flickering server towers. Shelves were stacked with old physical media, data tapes, memory crystals, relics of old wars. Saris ran her hand along a row of labeled crystals. Titan Uprising, The Siege of Vor, Operation Silent Night. She stopped. A small, jagged crystal lay on a table, pulsing with a faint, erratic light. It was labeled in handwritten scrawl, Erythra Campaign, classified raw footage. The world seemed to stop. The blood roared in Saris's ears. She knew she shouldn't touch it. Kyle was in the other room. They were safe for the moment. She should walk away, but she couldn't. That word, Erythra. It was a tombstone. She reached out, her hand trembling, and slotted the crystal into a dusty viewer on the desk. Don't! Kale's voice shouted from the other room. He must have seen a sensor trip, or maybe he just felt the shift in the air, but it was too late. The holographic projector sputtered to life, the room filled with light. It wasn't a flat image. It was a volumetric projection, surrounding her. Suddenly, she wasn't in a dusty room on a moon, she was floating in orbit. Below her hung Erythra. It was green. It was so impossibly green. She saw the swirling cloud patterns over the Velen Ocean. She saw the glittering lights of the capital city. Her city, pulsing like a heartbeat on the night side of the planet. It was beautiful. It was whole. Then, the comms chatter began. It was cold, professional, terrifyingly calm. Alpha flight in position. Target locked. Shields are down. Copy that. Alpha leader. Initiation in 3, 2, 1. Saris watched, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream as the atmosphere ignited. It started as a pinprick of white light in the upper stratosphere. Then, it blossomed. It spread like ink in water, but it was fire, a cascading wave of thermal energy that rolled across the continents. The green forests turned black, then gray, then vanished. The oceans boiled into steam, obscuring the surface in a shroud of death. The hologram shifted, It changed perspective to a cockpit view, a gun cam feed. She saw the targeting reticle hovering over the royal palace. Her home. Structure identified. A voice said, "Targeting main reactor. Burn it." The voice. Saris froze. The voice was younger, lighter, but the cadence was unmistakable. The flat, dry tone. She looked at the telemetry data scrolling in the corner of the projection. Pilot ID, Riven 3. Unit, 44th Strike Wing. Status, engaged. The camera view shifted slightly as the pilot checked his 6. For a second, just a split second, the reflection of the pilot was visible in the canopy glass. It was Kale. He was younger. His face was unscarred, his eyes clear. He looked calm. He looked focused. He looked like a man doing a job. Saris watched as the younger Kale's hand moved on the stick. She watched his thumb flip the safety cover on the weapon release. She watched him press the button. On the screen, the palace where her mother was sleeping, where her father was reading in the library, where her little brother was playing, vaporized in a column of white fire. "No," Saris whispered. The hologram flickered. Saris turned around. Kale was standing in the doorway. He was pale, his face a mask of absolute horror. He had his hand outstretched, as if to physically grab the light and stuff it back into the box. "Turn it off," Kale croaked. Saris didn't move. She stood amidst the ghosts of her burning world, the light of the explosion reflecting in her wide, black eyes. Her bioluminescent markings were flaring so bright they were painful to look at. A blinding violet stroboscope of agony. "You," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Kale took a step forward. "Saris, listen to me." "You," she screamed. The sound tore out of her throat, raw and animalistic. Kale raised his hands. "I didn't know, I swear to you, I didn't know it was... You were there." Saris pointed at the hologram, where the world was still burning in silence. "That is your voice. That is your face. You led them." "I was a lieutenant," Kale shouted back, desperation cracking his voice. "We were told it was a military stronghold. We were told the planet had been evacuated. They said it was a separatist base housing biological weapons. You burned the cities." Saris was crying now, the tears glowing like lava on her cheeks. "You burned the forests. There were no weapons. There were only families. I didn't know." Kyle pleaded. He looked like a man drowning. "We followed orders. We dropped the payload and you turned my home into glass," Saris whispered. Her voice dropped, trembling with a rage so deep it shook the floor. She looked at him, really looked at him, and the horror on her face shifted into something worse. Betrayal. Because she had started to care. She had started to feel safe with him. She had let him touch her. "I am Saris Valen," she said, her voice rising again, vibrating with power. "I am the daughter of the king you murdered. I am the royal asset your directive demands be terminated." Kale stopped breathing. The room spun. The daughter. He had bought the freedom of the woman whose life he had destroyed. He had fallen in love with the ghost of his own sin. "Oh God," Kale whispered. He fell to his knees. The weight of it was too much to stand under. "Saris, I am so sorry, sorry," she shrieked. The air in the room compressed. The pressure dropped instantly. Saris threw her arms out. A shockwave of pure psionic force exploded from her body. It wasn't like the accidental flare in the tech den. This was focused. This was hate. The holographic projector shattered. The shelves along the walls splintered, sending data crystals raining down like shrapnel. Kyle was lifted off his feet and thrown backward. He slammed into the wall with a bone-jarring crunch and slid to the floor, gasping for air. In the main room, Jack screamed as his console sparked and died. Monitors exploded in showers of glass. Sarah stood in the center of the ruin, her chest heaving, her hands glowing with violet fire. She looked at Cale, huddled against the wall, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. She wanted to kill him. Every cell in her body screamed for it. It would be justice. It would be right. She raised her hand, focusing the energy into a spear of light. Cale didn't move. He didn't reach for his weapon, he just looked up at her, his eyes full of tears, and waited. He wanted her to do it. That realization hit Saris harder than the betrayal. He wasn't fighting back. He was offering himself. Her hand trembled. She looked at the man who had bought her out of a cage, the man who had held her when the collar came off, the man who had refused to take her body when she offered it, and the man who had burned her mother. She couldn't separate them. They were the same man. She let out a sob of frustration and lowered her hand. The energy dissipated, leaving the room dark and smelling of ozone. "Why?" she whispered. "Broken? Why did you have to be him?" Jax rolled his hover chair into the doorway, sparks raining from his mechanical eye. He looked from the shattered projector to Saris, then to Cale. He pieced it together. The footage, the name, the girl. "You're the princess," Jax said quietly. "The Erythran heir." Saris didn't answer. She was staring at Cale. Jax cleared his throat, his usual sarcasm gone. "Listen, you need to know something. Both of you, shut up." "Jax." Cale wheezed, clutching his ribs. "No," Jax said. "She needs to hear it. The Erythra campaign. I've been digging while you were in here screaming." Jax tapped a surviving data pad. "It wasn't a military operation," Jax said. "Not really. The orders were falsified. The intelligence reports about bioweapons? Faked." Saris turned her head slowly to look at him. "What?" "It was a sanitation job," Jax said grimly. Erythra was sitting on a deposit of heavy isotopes that the Coalition needed for the new fleet drive systems. Diplomatic channels were taking too long, so someone high up decided to erase the negotiation. Jax looked at Cale. "Your squadron didn't target insurgents. Cale, you were the demolition crew for a mining operation. They used you to clear the real estate." Cale closed his eyes. It was worse. It was somehow worse. It wasn't even war. It was greed. Saris looked at Cale. He was a pawn, a weapon used by another hand. But a weapon still kills. She turned away from him. "I cannot look at you," she said. "Saris," Cale whispered. "Do not speak my name," she snapped. She stormed out of the room, her boots crunching on the broken glass. She didn't run this time. She marched. She marched back toward the ship because she had nowhere else to go. The universe was empty for her now. Cale tried to stand, groaned, and fell back. Jax hovered over him. "You okay, buddy?" "Who signed the order?" Cale asked. His voice was dead. Jax looked at the data pad. "Admiral Darius Holt?" "Holt," Cale repeated. The name tasted like ash. "He is a senator now," Jax said. "Running on the peace and security ticket. Very popular. Polling high in the core worlds." Cale forced himself to his feet. He wiped the blood from his forehead. "Get me everything," Cale said. "Every log, every comms transcript, every dirty credit transfer connected to Holt and the Erythra burn." Jax hesitated. "Cale, if you go after a senator..." "He killed her world," Cale said, "and he made me pull the trigger." Cale limped toward the door. "Get the data, Jax. I'm going to bury him. Back on the Wayfarer." Saris was dismantling her life. She was in the small guest cabin. She had ripped the sheets off the bunk. She had thrown the few books Cale had given her across the room. She had smashed the mirror in the small refresher unit. She stood amidst the wreckage, breathing hard. She hated him. She hated him for what he did, but mostly she hated herself. She hated. Because even now, with the image of her burning home seared into her retinas, she could still feel the phantom warmth of his hands on her shoulders. She could still hear the rough kindness in his voice. She wanted to hate him cleanly. She wanted him to be a monster. But he wasn't a monster. He was a broken man who had been tricked into doing a monstrous thing, and she loved him. The realization made her scream again, a short, sharp sound of fury. She grabbed a pillow and hurled it at the wall. The door chime beeped. "Go away," she yelled. The door slid open anyway. Kyle stood there. He looked terrible. His face was bruised, his jacket torn. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the last hour. He held a small black data chip in his hand. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Kyle said quietly. Saris turned her back to him. "Get out." Kyle stepped into the room. He placed the chip on the small metal desk. "This is everything," he said. Jax pulled the archives. "It has my flight logs. It has the voice recordings of me confirming the hits. It has my service number and my confession." Saris didn't turn. "It also has the proof about Admiral Holt." Kale continued. "It proves the orders were illegal. It proves it was a war crime." He paused. "If you take this to the tribunal," Kyle said, his voice steady, "they will execute Holt, and they will execute me, or lock me away for the rest of my life." Saris turned around slowly. She looked at the chip. Then she looked at him. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because it's yours," Kyle said. "It is your justice. You can use it to destroy the men who ordered it, and you can use it to destroy the man who did it." He looked her in the eye. He didn't flinch. "I won't stop you, Saris. If you want me dead, all you have to do is upload that file." Saris stared at him. He was handing her a loaded gun and pointing it at his own head. She walked over to the desk. She picked up the chip. It was cold and small. It contained the death of her world and the life of this man. She looked up at him. "You want me to do it," she said. "You want me to punish you because you cannot punish yourself enough." "I want you to have the choice," Kyle said. "You didn't have a choice in the cage. You didn't have a choice when we burned your home. You have a choice now." Saris reached out. She intended to shove him, to push him away, but her hand brushed his. Flash. The contact triggered a psychic bridge. It wasn't a blast this time. It was a flow. Saris was suddenly inside Kale's head. She was in the cockpit, the smell of recycled air and sweat, the shaking of her hands on the controls, the voice in her ear, "Burn it." She felt the trigger depress. She felt the sick lurch in her stomach as the missiles flew. Then, the aftermath. She felt Kale's body heaving as he vomited onto the deck of the flight line. She felt the cold, shaking terror in the barracks that night, the bottle of whiskey trembling in her hands, the nightmares that woke her up screaming. She felt the 10 years of drifting, the desire to die but the cowardice to live, the crushing, suffocating weight of the guilt, every day, every single day. And then she felt the moment he saw her in the cage, the spark of light in the darkness, the desperate, illogical need to save her, just to balance the scales by 1 micrometer. The connection broke. Saris gasped and pulled her hand back. She staggered, clutching the desk. She had seen his soul. It was a ruin. It was as scarred and burnt as Erythra. She looked at him, her eyes wide. "You have been burning for 10 years, she whispered. Kale looked away. "I deserve it." Saris clutched the chip in her fist. The sharp edges dug into her palm. She hated him. She loved him. She wanted to kill him. She wanted to save him. "Get out," she said again. Her voice was weak. Kyle nodded. He turned and walked out of the cabin, the door sliding shut behind him. Sarah stood alone in the wreckage of the room. She walked to the small viewport. Outside, the stars were cold and indifferent. She looked at the chip in her hand. "You burned my world," she whispered to the empty air. "And yet you held me like I was breakable." She pressed her forehead against the glass, the tears coming freely now. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to exist in a universe where her monster was also her savior. In the deep silence of space, 1,000 kilometers away, a sensor array pinged, a long, sleek frigate painted in matte black, bearing no official markings but carrying the signature of a coalition hunter-killer. Locked its targeting computers onto the Wayfarer's debt. Target acquired. The computer droned, initiating intercept course. Saris watched the stars, unaware that the darkness was coming for them both. The ambush did not begin with a warning hail. It began with a lance of particle fire that sheared through the void and slammed into the port shields of the Wayfarer's debt, shaking the ship like a toy in the jaws of a wolf. Cale Riven woke from a fitful doze in the pilot's seat to a cockpit bathed in crimson emergency strobes. His hands found the yoke before his eyes fully focused, muscle memory overriding the panic. "Shields down to 60%, Cale shouted, throwing the heavy freighter into a corkscrew dive. "Who is it?" Saris Valen was already in the co-pilot's seat. She did not look at the sensor readouts. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back against the headrest, her bioluminescent markings flaring with a sharp, staccato rhythm. She could feel them. "Hunter-killer frigate," Saris said, her voice tight with concentration. "The Obsidian. It is not looking for cargo. It is looking for blood." A second volley of fire streaked past the canopy, missing the hull by meters. The silence of space was a lie inside the ship. The hull groaned and screamed under the stress of the G-forces. "Hold on," Cale yelled. He slammed the throttle forward, bypassing the safeties on the sublight engines. The Wayfarer shuddered and bolted toward the dense asteroid field that ringed the dying star of the system. It was a suicide run, a chaotic grinder of tumbling rock and ice, but it was their only cover. The ship plunged into the field. The chase that followed was a dance of madness. Cale flew with a desperate razor-edge precision, threading the bulky ship through gaps that barely seemed wide enough for a fighter. He hauled the yoke left, fired the ventral thrusters, and spun the ship 90 degrees to slip between two colliding planetoids. "Incoming," Saris said, her eyes snapping open. 3 torpedoes, bearing 270. They are tracking our heat signature." Cale didn't question her. He didn't ask for radar confirmation. He trusted the ghost in her blood more than his own sensors. He cut the main engines, flipping the ship end over end using only the maneuvering thrusters. The sudden loss of heat confused the torpedoes for a fraction of a second. They streaked past the cockpit, close enough that Cale could see the rivets on their casings, before detonating against a massive asteroid behind them. The shockwave slammed into the Wayfarer, sending them tumbling. "Stabilize!" Cale roared, fighting the controls. Saris reached out, her hand hovering over the navigation console. She wasn't typing, she was pushing. Cale could feel the static charge in the air, the smell of ozone rising as she extended her senses outward, wrapping the ship in a bubble of awareness. "Pitch down," Saris commanded. "Now!" Cale shoved the stick forward. The ship dove. A split second later, a beam of coherent light slashed through the space they had just occupied, instantly vaporizing a chunk of rock the size of a city block. "We can't keep this up," Cale gritted out. sweat stinging his eyes. "They are faster, and they have more guns. We need to vanish. I can hide us," Sarah said. Cale glanced at her. The asteroid field was too thin to block their sensors indefinitely. "How?" "My field," Sarah said, unbuckling her harness. "If I channel it through the drive core, I can amplify the engine signature. I can create an echo, a ghost ship." "It will tear you apart," Kyle said, jerking the ship right to avoid a spinning fragment of ice. "The feedback alone would kill you." "Not if you anchor me," Sarah said. She stood up, the gravity of the turn pulling at her, but she held her ground. "You have to ground the connection, physical contact. You have to hold me together." "Cale." Cale looked at her. Her face was pale, lit by the violet fire of her markings. She looked terrified, but resolute. "Take the stick," Cale yelled to the autopilot, engaging the flight computer to maintain their erratic course. He scrambled out of the pilot's seat. They ran back through the shuddering corridor, the ship lurching violently as the computer dodged another volley. They reached the engineering bay. It was a cramped, hot metal box dominated by the throbbing pulse of the fusion drive. The air here was thick with radiation warnings and the smell of superheated coolant. Saris moved to the maintenance access panel. She placed her hands directly onto the shielding of the drive core. "Hold me," she ordered. "Don't let go." Kyle stepped behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back hard against his chest. He locked his hands together over her stomach, bracing his legs against the bulkhead. "Do it," Kyle whispered into her ear. Saris closed her eyes and screamed. It was a silent scream, a psychic release that blasted through the room. She poured her energy into the drive core. The fusion reactor roared in protest, the sound climbing to a deafening shriek. Pain lashed through them both. For Cale, it felt like grabbing a live wire. He felt the surge of her power rushing through her skin and into his arms, a torrent of white-hot energy that made his teeth ache. But for Saris, it was agony. She was acting as a lens for a fusion reaction. She convulsed in his arms, her back arching, her head thrown back against his shoulder. "I've got you!" Cale shouted over the roar, tightening his grip until his muscles burned. "I've got you, Saris!" The ship shook violently. The lights blew out, leaving them illuminated only by the blinding violet aura radiating from Saris's skin. The pain blurred into something else. The boundaries between them dissolved in the energy storm. Cale could feel her fear, her rage, and the desperate, clawing need to survive. And she could feel him, his rock-solid presence, the wall she was leaning against, the man who was refusing to let her break. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. They were one organism, fused by heat and adrenaline. "I'm sorry," Kyle gasped, his face buried in the curve of her neck, his voice ragged. "I'm sorry for the world. I'm sorry for everything. Just live. Please, just live." Saris couldn't speak. She pushed harder, expanding the echo. Outside the ship, the Wayfarer's sensor signature split. A massive, phantom duplicate of the freighter appeared on the frigate's scanners, veering sharply toward the star. The Obsidian took the bait. The frigate broke pursuit, chasing the ghost. "Now!" Saris choked out. Cale saw the opening. He didn't need to be in the cockpit to know what to do. He shouted a command to the ship's voice interface. "Computer, emergency vent, dive into the radiation belt." The Wayfarer vented its coolant plasma, creating a cloud of interference, and plunged into the swirling toxic clouds of the nearby nebula. The roar of the engine died down. The shaking stopped. In the engineering bay, the light faded. Saris collapsed. Cale went down with her, cushioning her fall. They hit the metal grating of the floor in a tangle of limbs. For a long time, the only sound was the harsh rasp of their breathing. Kyle lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving. Saris was draped across him, her face pressed into his shirt, her body trembling with aftershocks. Kyle's arms were still locked around her. He couldn't unclench his fingers. He looked down. Her hair was a mess, sticking to her damp forehead. Her markings were dim, pulsing weakly. "You're crazy," Kyle wheezed. "You are absolutely crazy." Saris let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She shifted, trying to push herself up, but her arms gave out. She fell back onto his chest. "I am alive," she whispered. "Yeah," Kyle said, bringing one hand up to stroke her hair, a gesture so automatic he didn't realize he was doing it. "We're alive." They stayed there for 10 minutes, simply breathing, letting the heat of their bodies anchor them back to reality. The anger, the betrayal, the politics. It all felt very far away. Right here, on the floor of a dying ship, there was only the heartbeat he could feel under his hand. An hour later, the Wayfarer was drifting silently in the heart of the radiation storm, hidden from sensors. Kyle sat on the edge of a biobed in the small medical bay. He was holding an ice pack to a burn on his forearm where the energy discharge had arced. Saris sat on the opposite bed. She looked exhausted, her skin translucent, shadows bruising the area under her eyes. She was watching him. "Why didn't you leave me?" she asked. The question broke the silence like a dropped glass. Kale didn't look up. "We needed the maneuver. I needed to hold you." "No," Saris said. "Before that, when you found out who I was, when you gave me the chip, you could have dropped me at the nearest port and vanished. You could have saved yourself." Kyle lowered the ice pack. He looked at the burn on his arm. "I'm tired of saving myself," he said quietly. "I've been saving myself for 10 years. It's a miserable way to live." "You are afraid," Saris observed. "Yes," Kyle admitted. "I'm terrified." "Of the Admiral?" "No, of you." He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "I look at you, and I see the worst thing I ever did," Kale said, his voice raw. "But I also see—" He stopped. He couldn't say it. He had no right to say it. "Say it," Saris whispered. "I see the only thing that makes me want to wake up in the morning," Kale confessed, "and that terrifies me, because I have no right to want anything from you. I have no right to even be in the same room as you." Saris stood up. She walked across the small space between the beds. She stopped in front of him. "You are a coward, Kale Riven." Kale gave a dry, humorless laugh. "I know. You think your guilt protects you," she said. "You think if you hate yourself enough, it balances the scales. It does not." She reached out and took the ice pack from his hand. She set it aside. She took his hand in hers. Her skin was cool, her fingers strong. "Part of me wants to rip you apart," Saris said softly. "When I look at you, I hear the fire. I hear the screaming." Kale flinched, trying to pull his hand away, but she held tight. "But the other part of me," Saris continued, her voice trembling, "wants to stay in your arms until I can't hear the screaming anymore." She looked down at him, her eyes shining with tears. "I am so tired of the screaming." "Kale." Kale looked at her hand holding his. The contrast. Her pale, violet-tinged skin against his scarred, calloused knuckles. Enemy and savior. Victim and monster. "We should go," Kale said, his voice thick. "We can't stay here. The radiation shielding won't last forever." Saris nodded, but she didn't let go of his hand for a long moment. They made landfall 12 hours later on a moon called Ethelgard. It was a neutral territory, a graveyard of an old civilization that had died out 1,000 years ago. The Resistance, contacts Jax had sent them to, had set up a safe house in the ruins of a stone temple deep in the equatorial rainforest. The Wayfarer was hidden under a camouflage net in a clearing, Kyle and Sarah sat in the main chamber of the temple. It was a haunting place. The roof was gone, replaced by a flickering energy field that kept out the torrential rain. Water hissed and steamed against the shield above them, casting rippling shadows across the ancient stone floor. The only light came from a circle of fat, tallow candles the resistance fighters had left behind, and a small portable heater that glowed orange in the corner. They had eaten a silent meal of rations. Now, the argument began. We have the evidence, Kale said, pacing the stone floor. His voice echoed in the vast chamber. Jack sent the encryption keys. We can upload it to the Galactic Newsnet from here. Anonymous drop. Then we disappear. And then what? Saris asked. She was sitting on a stone bench wrapped in a blanket, watching the rain hammer against the shield. Then we go to the Outer Rim, Kale said. I know a place. A colony on the edge of wild space. Nobody asks names. We can live there. You can be safe. Safe, Saris repeated with a scoff. You want to hide. I want you to live, Kyle snapped, spinning to face her. Holt has a fleet. Saris, he has the entire coalition navy. If we show our faces, we are dead. If we hide, he wins, Saris said, standing up. She let the blanket fall. If we upload it anonymously, he will spin it. He will call it a deep fake. He will say it is alien propaganda. He is already controlling the narrative. So what is the plan? Kale asked, throwing his hands up. We walk into the lion's den? Yes, Saris said. We take it to the tribunal. In person. You're insane. I am a princess of Erythra, Saris said, her voice rising. I am not a data packet to be uploaded from the shadows. I need to stand there. I need them to see me. I need them to look in my eyes when they hear the truth. They will kill you before you get within 10 feet of the podium, Kale argued, stepping closer to her. Then you will protect me, Saris said. I can't protect you from an army, Kyle shouted. I am just one pilot. You are the only one I trust, Saris shouted back. The silence that followed was sudden and deafening. The only sound was the hiss of the rain above and the crackle of the heater. Kale stared at her. The words hung in the air. The only one I trust. He stepped closer. The distance between them shrank to nothing. He could see the gold flecks in her black eyes. He could see the pulse of light at her temple. Why? Kale whispered. Why do you trust me? I am the reason you have nothing to trust. Saris looked up at him. She reached up and cupped his face. Her hands were shaking. Because you stayed, she said. Because you came back. Because you are hurting as much as I am. She ran her thumb along the scar on his cheekbone. I don't want to hide. Kyle, she whispered. And I don't want to go to the Outer Rim alone. Kale's breath hitched. He looked at her mouth. He knew he shouldn't. He knew this was the line. If he crossed it, there was no going back. He started to pull away. I can't. Saris didn't let him. She rose on her toes and closed the final inch. She kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss, and it was a collision, and it was fierce, hungry, and desperate. It tasted of salt and grief. It was the kiss of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding to jump together. Kale froze for a heartbeat, his mind screaming 1,000 warnings. Then, the dam broke. He made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her off her feet, crushing her against him. He kissed her back with a decade of repressed emotion. He kissed her like he could breathe life back into her dead world, like he could erase his sins with the pressure of his mouth. Saris clung to him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her bioluminescence flaring bright and wild, bathing them in shifting patterns of violet light. She poured everything into the kiss, her anger, her loss, her forgiveness. They stumbled back, hitting the stone wall of the temple. Kale shielded her head with his hand, never breaking the kiss. The sensation was overwhelming, the scratch of his stubble, the softness of her lips, the heat radiating from her skin. It was wrong. It was history's greatest violation. The executioner and the survivor. And it was right. It was the only thing that had ever felt right. They slid down the wall to the makeshift bed of blankets on the floor. Hands fumbled with zippers and clasps, frantic and clumsy. There was no seduction here, only a raw, starving need to be close, to be skin to skin, to let the physical sensation obliterate the past. Kyle buried his face in her neck, whispering her name like a prayer. Saris arched against him, her tears wetting his face, her light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. They didn't make love, they collided. They sought oblivion in each other, trying to merge their broken pieces into something whole. The aftermath was quiet. The storm outside had passed, leaving a heavy, dripping silence in the jungle. Inside the temple, the heater hummed. They lay tangled under the blankets. Kale was on his back, one arm thrown over his eyes. Saris lay beside him, her head on his chest, her hand resting over his heart. Kale stared at the flickering energy shield above. The guilt was back. But it was different now. It wasn't a crushing weight. It was a dull ache, a scar tissue. "I'm a war criminal," Kale said to the ceiling. His voice was hoarse. "Nothing changes that." Saris shifted. She propped herself up on one elbow and looked down at him. Her hair spilled over her shoulders, a dark curtain around them. "You are," she agreed softly. Kyle winced. "But you are not only that," she said. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his. "I decide what you are to me. Kale, not the tribunal, not the history books, not even you." She kissed him gently on the forehead. "You are the man who bought my freedom. You are the man who held me while I burned. And you are the man who is going to help me fix this." Kyle closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." A chirping sound broke the moment. It was Kale's datapad, discarded on the floor near his boots. A priority override signal. Kale groaned and sat up, rubbing his face. He reached for the pad. "It's Jax," he said. He accepted the connection. A holographic image of Jax's head flickered into existence above the pad. "Sorry to interrupt the honeymoon," Jax said, his voice tense. "But we have a problem." "What is it?" Kale asked, his voice snapping back into soldier mode. "Holt," Jax said. "He just gave a speech to the Senate. He's claiming that rogue alien elements are planning a terrorist strike on the core worlds. He's asking for emergency powers, a suspension of the tribunal's oversight. He's seizing control," Saris said, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "It gets worse," Jax said. "I tracked the funding for the bounty hunters. Holt isn't just hunting you, Princess. He's funding the slaver rings. He's been rounding up Erythran survivors from the diaspora and selling them to the Rim to keep them quiet. He's erasing the witnesses." Saris went still. The light on her skin turned a cold, hard blue. "He is selling my people," she whispered. "If he gets those emergency powers," Jax said, "he'll be untouchable. The vote is in 48 hours. We have to move," Kyle said. "We can't wait for an anonymous upload to filter through the news cycle." Saris stood up. She dropped the blanket, unashamed of her nudity, standing tall in the dim light. She looked like an avenging angel carved from marble and light. "We are going to the tribunal," she stated. Kale looked at her. He nodded slowly. "Jax," Kale said, "can you get us landing clearance for the capital station?" "I can get you a fake diplomatic clearance," Jax said. "But once you're on the station, You're on your own. Security will be tight. Do it, Kale said. He cut the connection. He looked at Saris. We need clothes. If we are walking into the lion's den, we need to look like we own the place. The sun was rising over the jungle when they prepared to leave. Kyle had raided the supply crates left by the resistance. He found an old dress uniform, Terran Fleet issue. It was dusty and smelled of mothballs, but it fit. He buttoned the high collar. He pinned his old rank insignia to the shoulder. He looked in the cracked mirror propped against a stone pillar. He looked like the officer he used to be, the man who had burned a world. It made his skin crawl. Sarah stepped into the light. She had found a sleek, black formal gown, likely left behind by a diplomat fleeing the war years ago. It was simple, elegant, with a high slit up the leg and a back that plunged low. She had modified it. She had torn strips from the silver thermal blankets and woven them into the bodice, creating a pattern that mirrored the bioluminescence on her skin. She didn't cover her markings. She framed them. She turned her alien nature into high fashion. She looked regal. She looked terrifying. You look, Kale started, but the words failed him. I look like a queen, Sarah said. She walked over to him and straightened his collar. And you look like a soldier. I hate this uniform, Kyle muttered, tugging at the cuffs. Good, Sarah said. Wear it anyway. Let them see the uniform, and then let them hear the confession. She turned to the exit, where the wayfarer waited. Kyle stepped up behind her. He placed his hand on the small of her back. The contact was electric, a reminder of the night before. A silent promise. Ready? He asked. Saris took a breath. No. She looked back at him, a fierce smile touching her lips. Let's go start a war. They walked out of the ruins, hand in hand, stepping into the morning light and a future they probably wouldn't survive. The orbital station Aurelius Crown hung in the void above the gas giant Jupiter 9 like a diamond necklace suspended over a bruised peach. It was a masterpiece of Terran engineering, a ring of spun silver and transparent aluminum that housed the beating heart of the coalition government. From the outside, it looked like paradise. Inside, the air smelled of lavender, recycled oxygen, and old money. Kale Riven adjusted the collar of his dress uniform for the 10th time in as many minutes. The high, stiff fabric chafed his neck, a physical reminder of the life he had walked away from 10 years ago. The navy blue material was immaculate, the gold braiding on the shoulders polished to a mirror shine. But to Kale, it felt like wearing a shroud. Stop fidgeting, Saris murmured, leaning into him. You look almost respectable. Kale glanced down at her. She was a vision of dark elegance. The black gown she wore was sleek and dangerous, cut to allow movement but designed to draw the eye. She had woven strips of thermal silver fabric into the bodice, creating a pattern that mirrored the bioluminescent swirls on her skin. She didn't look like a refugee. She looked like a visiting dignitary from a civilization far older and crueler than humanity. I feel like a target, Kale muttered, keeping his voice low. His eyes scanned the crowd moving through the grand concourse. Everyone here has a smile that costs more than my ship. Saris adjusted her grip on his arm. Her fingers were cool, but he could feel the tension radiating off her. Observe the man to your left, Saris whispered, tilting her head slightly toward a bloated diplomat in purple robes. Look at his spine. Your species has terrible posture. It is a wonder you conquered the stars when you walk as if gravity is a personal insult. Kyle choked back a laugh, the sound turning into a cough. He looked at the diplomat, who was indeed slouching magnificently. We compensate with enthusiasm, Kale whispered back. And the women, Saris continued, her eyes darting to a group of socialites wearing gravity-defying headpieces. Why do they wear structures on their heads? Is it to signal mating availability or simply to test neck strength? It is fashion. Saris. It doesn't have to make sense. Primitive, she decided. The banter was a shield. Kale knew it, and she knew it. Beneath the light teasing, they were both coiled springs. Kyle could feel the weight of the compact blaster pistol specifically modified to bypass metal detectors tucked into the small of his back. He knew Saris had 3 encrypted data chips sewn into the hem of her dress. And in his ear, a tiny undetectable receiver buzzed with the voice of Jax Marin. Audio check. Jax's voice crackled, sounding tinny and distant. You two look adorable. Very prom night. Focus, Jax, Kale murmured, touching his ear as if adjusting a comms link. Are we clear? Clear as crystal, Jax replied. I have looped the security feeds in Sector 4. You are a ghost in the machine until you hit the main reception hall. But heads up. The place is crawling with Holt's private security. They are wearing tribunal guard uniforms. But they move like mercenaries. We see them, Kale said. He spotted 2 guards by a fountain, their eyes tracking the crowd with professional paranoia. They reached the heavy durasteel doors of the celestial ballroom. A protocol droid blocked their path, its golden chassis gleaming. Invitation. Please, the droid chirped. Saris stepped forward. She didn't offer a card. She simply looked at the droid with an air of imperious boredom. I am Envoy Valen of the Rim Coalition, she lied smoothly. And this is Captain Riven, my military attaché. We are personal guests of Senator Holt. The droid processed this. Jax, now, Kale thought, patching the guest list. Now, Jax whispered. The droid's optical sensors flashed blue. Welcome. Envoy Valen. The Senator is expecting you. The doors hissed open. The ballroom was vast, a cavern of polished marble and crystal chandeliers. One entire wall was a viewport looking down at the swirling storms of Jupiter 9. Hundreds of guests mingled, senators, admirals, corporate magnates, clinking glasses of champagne and discussing the fate of worlds as if they were trading sports scores. At the far end of the room, on a raised dais, stood Darius Holt. He looked exactly like his campaign posters, tall, silver-haired, with a face that radiated grandfatherly wisdom and steely resolve. He was wearing a civilian suit, modest but expensive, projecting the image of a humble servant of the people. He was speaking to a small crowd of admirers, laughing at a joke. Kyle felt Saris stiffen against his side, her hand clamped onto his bicep with enough force to bruise. That is him, she whispered. The sound was barely a breath, but it carried a lethal weight. Steady, Kale murmured. He burned it, Saris said. Her voice shook. She wasn't looking at a politician. She was looking at a monster. She was seeing the firestorm that had consumed her mother. Look at him. Kyle. He is laughing. Kale felt his own rage rise, a hot, acidic tide in his chest. He wanted to draw the pistol. He wanted to march across the marble floor and put a hole in Holt's forehead. It would be easy. It would be satisfying. And it would doom them both. Saris, Kyle said, placing his hand over hers on his arm. We do this the right way. Remember? We don't just kill the man. We kill the lie. Saris took a deep breath. Her bioluminescent markings flared briefly, concealed by the shimmering fabric of her dress, then dimmed. She turned her gaze to Kale. Her eyes were hard, glossy black stones. You are right, she said. Let us go say hello. They moved through the crowd. Kale felt like he was walking underwater. Every face he passed belonged to someone who had likely profited from the war, from the erasure of Erythra. As they approached the dais, Holt turned. His eyes swept over them, pausing. He didn't recognize Saris. He believed the princess was dead, and he had never seen her face up close. But he recognized the uniform. A captain of the fleet, Holt boomed, stepping down from the dais with his hand extended. Always an honor to see a man in uniform. Kyle stopped. He looked at the hand that had signed the order, the hand that had erased a civilization. He forced himself to take it. His skin crawled. "Senator," Kyle said. His voice was flat, mechanical. "Darius Holt," the senator said, shaking Kale's hand firmly. "And who might you be, son?" "Kale Riven, sir, former 44th Strike Wing." Holt's smile didn't waver, but his eyes flickered, a microscopic tightening of the muscles around his mouth. He knew the name. "Riven," Holt repeated. "Ah, yes. The heroes of the border wars. A loyal son of the fleet. We owe you a great debt. Captain." Kale felt a tremor start in his hand. A loyal son. The audacity of the man was breathtaking. He wanted to scream. He wanted to break Holt's fingers one by one. Saris squeezed his arm. It was a sharp, grounding pinch. "Wait." Her touch said. "This is Envoy Valen," Kyle said, pulling his hand away from Holt's grip as if he had touched rot. Holt turned his charm on Saris. He bowed slightly. "A pleasure, my dear. I don't believe we've met." "We have not," Saris said. Her voice was ice. "But I have heard a great deal about your work, Senator. Your dedication to cleaning up the galaxy is legendary." Holt chuckled, taking it as a compliment. "We do what we must for peace, Envoy." A chime sounded through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced, "the Committee on Refugee Affairs is now in session." "That is our cue," Holt said, checking his chrono. "If you will excuse me, duty calls." He walked away, surrounded by his entourage. Kale let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "I almost lost it." "I know," Saris said. She looked at Holt's retreating back. "But now we have him." "Jax," Kale said into the comms, "is the hearing room prepped?" "I am in the system," Jax replied. "The moment Saris steps up to the podium, I will hijack the station's main broadcast array. We are going to turn a closed-door meeting into the highest-rated show in the galaxy." "Let's go," Kale said. They headed toward the service corridors that led to the tribunal chambers. The route Jax had plotted was supposed to be clear, bypassing the main security checkpoints. They turned down a long white hallway lined with potted ferns. It was empty. Too empty, Kyle thought. A clerk stepped out of a side door. He was carrying a stack of data pads, wearing the gray livery of a station functionary. He kept his head down, hurrying toward them. Kyle moved a step aside, making room. At the last second, the clerk looked up. His eyes were dead voids. He dropped the data pads. From his sleeve, a silver blur snapped out. A monofilament blade, a wire so thin it could cut through diamond, suspended in a magnetic field. He lunged for Saris. Kyle didn't think. He didn't have time to draw his weapon. He threw his body across Saris's path, shoving her into the wall. He felt a cold sting in his side. The assassin's momentum carried him past, but he spun instantly, the wire humming. "Run!" Kale shouted. He kicked out, catching the assassin in the knee. The man grunted but didn't fall. He was enhanced, cybernetic reflexes. Saris didn't run. She raised her hand. A pulse of kinetic force slammed into the assassin, throwing him backward into a marble pillar. His head cracked against the stone with a sickening thud, and he slumped to the floor, the monofilament blade deactivating with a hiss. Kyle stumbled, clutching his side. His hand came away wet and red. Kale! Saris gasped, grabbing him. The uniform jacket was sliced open. The cut was deep, slicing through the reinforced fabric and into the muscle of his oblique. Blood was soaking the gold braid. "I'm fine," Kyle gritted out, though his face was gray. "Just a scratch. We have to move. He won't be the only one." They heard the sound of heavy boots pounding down the corridor behind them. "This way!" Saris pulled him toward a service elevator. She slammed her hand against the control panel, overriding the lock with a burst of psionic static. The doors groaned open. They spilled inside. Saris punched the button for the tribunal level. The doors slid shut just as 3 security guards rounded the corner, weapons raised. A plasma bolt scorched the metal door as it sealed. The elevator began to ascend. The air inside was stale and smelled of grease. Kyle slid down the wall, his legs giving out. He pressed his hand to the wound, trying to stem the flow. "Damn it," he wheezed. "I just got this uniform cleaned." Saris dropped to her knees beside him. She wasn't panicking. She was focused. She ripped the tear in his jacket wider, exposing the wound. It was ugly, a clean surgical slice that was bleeding sluggishly. "Hold still," she ordered. She placed her hands directly on his skin. Kyle hissed as her palms touched the raw flesh. But the pain vanished instantly, replaced by a searing heat. Saris closed her eyes. Her markings flared blindingly bright, casting violet shadows around the cramped metal box. Kyle could feel the energy flowing out of her. It wasn't just warmth, it was life. It was a vibration that knit cells back together, cauterizing the blood vessels, accelerating the clotting. It was intimate. It felt like she was reaching inside his ribcage and holding his heart. Kale looked at her face. She was sweating, her lips parted, her expression fierce and terrified. "You are not allowed to die," she murmured, her voice thick with strain. "I'm trying not to," Kale whispered. "Do not try. Do!" She pressed harder, the heat intensifying until Kale gasped, his back arching off the floor. "I need you alive, Kale Riven. I need you to stand next to me." The bleeding stopped. The wound was still there, an angry red line, but it was closed. Saris pulled her hands back. She swayed, dizzy from the exertion. Kyle caught her. He put his clean hand on the back of her neck, pulling her forehead to his. They stayed there for a moment, breaths mingling in the small space. The alarm klaxons were blaring outside, a rhythmic wailing, but inside the box there was only them. That was intense, Kale managed to say. A half-hysterical laugh bubbled up in his chest. "Is that standard medical procedure on Erythra?" "Only for people we intend to keep," Saris whispered. Her eyes opened, dark and bottomless. There was a playfulness in her voice, but beneath it was a raw, jagged fear. She looked at him like he was the only solid thing in a disintegrating universe. The elevator chimed. "We are here," Kale said. He helped her up. They straightened their clothes. Kale buttoned his jacket over the bloodstain. It looked like a dark shadow on the blue fabric. "Ready?" Kale asked. Saris smoothed her dress. She lifted her chin. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the mask of the queen. "Open the door," she commanded. The tribunal chamber was a circular amphitheater. Rows of seats rose toward a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time star chart. In the center, a single podium stood in a pool of white light. The session was already underway. 5 high judges sat on a raised bench, looking bored. Darius Holt was seated in the front row of the gallery, flanked by his aides. The doors at the back of the chamber banged open, heads turned. The murmur of conversation died. Saris Valen walked down the center aisle. She walked alone. Kyle stayed a few paces back, his hand hovering near his hidden weapon, his eyes scanning the gallery. Saris didn't look at the judges. She didn't look at Holt. She looked straight ahead. As she stepped into the pool of light, she let the psychic dampeners fall. Her markings blazed. The constellations on her neck and arms pulsed with a vibrant, undeniable violet light. She was no longer hiding. "Who is this?" the Chief Justice demanded, leaning forward. "This is a closed session." Saris reached the podium. She gripped the edges with hands that did not shake. "My name," she said, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the room, "is Saris Valen. I am the daughter of King Aris. I am the Princess of Erythra." A gasp rippled through the chamber. Darius Holt stood up, his face draining of color. "This is an imposter," Holt shouted, pointing a shaking finger. "The royal family perished in the disaster. Security, remove this woman. Jax, do it!" Cale hissed into his comms. "We are live in 3, 2, 1, Jax replied. "Smile, Senator." Huge holographic screens around the chamber, screens that were meant to display legal texts, suddenly flickered. The image changed. It wasn't just in the room. All over the station, on public viewports, in bars, on personal data pads, the feed was hijacked. Across the sector, the image of Saris standing in the light appeared. "Citizens of the Coalition," Saris said, looking directly into the camera drone that hovered nearby. "You have been told that my world died in a tragic accident. You have been told that Erythra was a threat." She paused. "You have been lied to." Holt was moving now, signaling frantically to his guards. "Cut the feed. Cut it now." But the feed stayed up, behind Saris. The giant screen shifted that it showed the footage from the archive, the green world, the firestorm, the cities turning to glass. And then, it showed the documents, the classified orders signed by Darius Holt, the transfer of funds from the mining corporations, the kill lists. "I am the last survivor of a genocide purchased by your elected leaders," Saris said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a planet. She pointed to Cale, who stepped forward into the light. "And this man," Saris said. The camera focused on Cale. He looked tired. He looked bloody. He looked like a wreck. "He bought the alien princess's freedom," Saris said, her voice breaking slightly. Not knowing she was the daughter of the world he burned, the silence in the chamber was absolute. Even Holt had frozen. "He is not innocent," Saris declared. "But neither am I, if I say nothing now." Cale looked at the judges. He didn't salute. He didn't ask for permission. "I am Captain Cale Riven," he said. His voice rasped, but it was clear. "I was the flight leader of the 44th. I dropped the incendiaries. I followed the orders issued by Admiral Holt." He looked at Holt. "I am guilty," Cale said. "I murdered a world, and I am here to surrender. But I am not going down alone." Pandemonium broke out. Holt's facade shattered. He looked at the cameras, at the judges, at the accusation written in 10-foot-tall letters on the screen. "Arrest them!" Holt screamed, his voice cracking. "They are terrorists. They are armed. Kill them!" The security guards, Holt's private mercenaries, drew their weapons. "Down!" Cale shouted. He tackled Saris, dragging her behind the heavy Durasteel podium just as the air filled with plasma fire. The tribunal chamber turned into a war zone. The judges scrambled for cover. Civilians screamed and fled. Cale rolled onto his back, drawing his pistol. He fired 2 shots over the top of the podium. 2 mercenaries went down, clutching their knees. "I am not killing them," Cale yelled over the noise. "We are not murderers." "Saris, I know," Saris shouted. She rose from a crouch. She didn't use a gun. She thrust her hands forward. A wave of kinetic force slammed into the advancing guards. It didn't crush them, it swept them off their feet, hurling them backward like rag dolls into the gallery seating. "We have to get to Holt," Saris yelled. They moved together. Kale provided suppressing fire, aiming for weapons and armor, keeping the heads of the mercenaries down. Saris was the battering ram, using her shields to deflect incoming fire and her telekinesis to clear the path. They were a perfect unit, the soldier and the scion. They moved up the aisle, fighting against the tide of security. Holt was trying to flee through a side exit. He was shoving aides out of his way, panic making him clumsy. Saris saw him. "No," she whispered. "You do not get to leave." She reached out. She didn't grab him with her hands. She grabbed his mind. She bypassed his physical body and seized his perception. Holt froze. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Saris closed her eyes, tears leaking out. She remembered. She remembered the sound of the atmosphere burning. She remembered the heat. She remembered the screams of her brother. She projected it all, every ounce of her trauma, every second of the nightmare she had lived for 10 years. She forced it into Darius Holt's brain. "Feel it," she commanded. Holt screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He curled into a ball on the floor of the chamber, sobbing, clawing at his ears, begging for it to stop. Saris held him there for 10 seconds. 10 seconds of judgment. Then she let him go. She sagged against Kyle, exhausted. "It is done," she whispered. The firing had stopped. The doors to the chamber burst open. But it wasn't more mercenaries. It was the station peacekeepers, the neutral blue-helmeted guard of the tribunal. Hundreds of them. "Weapons down!" a commander shouted. "Secure the area!" Kale dropped his pistol. He raised his empty hands. Saris stood beside him. She didn't raise her hands. She simply stood, watching the peacekeepers swarm the room. They surrounded Holt, who was still weeping on the floor. They shackled him. The Chief Justice, disheveled but unharmed, rose from behind the bench. He banged his gavel, the sound echoing through the ruined chamber. "Order!" the justice bellowed. "Senator Holt is to be taken into custody immediately. All authority is suspended pending a full inquiry." He looked at Kale and Saris. "And take them as well," the justice said, his voice softer. "But treat them gently. The galaxy is watching." The peacekeepers moved in. They didn't rough them up. They looked at Saris with awe and at Kale with a strange mixture of disgust and respect. Kale felt the handcuffs click around his wrists. He didn't fight. He felt lighter than he had in a decade. He looked at Saris. She was bloody. Her dress was torn. Her hair was wild, and she was smiling. A small, sad, tired smile. She reached out with her shackled hands and took his. Kale squeezed her fingers. Flashes of light erupted from the gallery. The press drones had arrived. They captured the image that would be plastered across every screen from the core to the rim by morning. The human pilot in his blood-stained uniform, the alien princess in her glowing gown, standing amidst the ruin of the government, holding hands, waiting for the future to judge them. "I'm still here," Kyle whispered to her as the guards led them away. "I know," Saris replied. "So am I." The detention block of the Aurelius Crown Tribunal facility was a study in gray walls, gray floors, gray jumpsuits. It smelled of antiseptic and suppressed rage. Kale Riven sat on the edge of his bunk in cell block 4. He had been offered a private cell in the officer's wing, a courtesy to his former rank and his current notoriety, but he had refused. He chose the general population block reserved for dishonorably discharged veterans and war criminals waiting for transport to the mining colonies. He wanted the noise. He wanted the hostility. He wanted the reminder. Across the mess hall, a group of ex-Marines glared at him. One of them spat on the floor. Cale didn't flinch. He just ate his nutrient loaf, which tasted like compressed sawdust, and stared at the wall, high above him, in the glittering spire district of the station. Saris Valen paced the length of a diplomatic suite that was larger than the entire detention block. The walls were covered in silk. The viewports offered a panoramic view of the gas giant's rings. A service droid hovered in the corner, holding a tray of fresh fruit and sparkling water. Saris picked up a crystal vase from a side table and considered throwing it through the viewport. She set it down with a sharp click. Protective custody. That was what the tribunal called it. To Saris, it felt like another cage. A nicer cage, with better lighting and no neural collar, but a cage nonetheless. She was the star witness, the tragic princess, the political pivot point of the century. She was too valuable to be left alone, so she was surrounded by guards who called her Your Highness and refused to let her open her own door. She marched to the hollow terminal in the center of the room and punched in a secure code. The air shimmered, and a blue-tinted projection of Kyle appeared. He looked tired. The dark circles under his eyes were bruising, and his hair was shorn close in the regulation prisoner cut. "You look terrible," Saris said, crossing her arms. "You look expensive," Cale countered, a faint smile touching his lips. "How is the palace life?" "Suffocating," Saris said. "The droid tried to feed me grapes earlier. I threatened to disassemble it." Cale chuckled. But the sound was rough. "Don't break the staff, Saris. It looks bad on the report." They fell silent. The distance between them was only a few kilometers of station infrastructure, but it felt like light years. They were suspended in the eye of the storm they had created. "Are you eating?" Saris asked, her voice softening. "I am consuming biomass," Cale said dryly. "I think it used to be cardboard. It fits the ambiance." "Cale," Saris said, dropping the banter. "The hearing is tomorrow." "I know." "They are going to ask you about the chain of command," she said. "I know," he repeated. "And I'm going to give them everything. Every name, every coordinate." "And what about you?" Saris asked. "What happens when they ask what you deserve?" Cale looked down at his hands, the hands that had flown the ship, the hands that had held her in the dark temple. "I deserve whatever they give me. Saris, I am not going to fight it." Saris stepped closer to the projection, as if she could force her will through the light. "You do not get to give up," she whispered fiercely. "We did not survive the asteroid field and the radiation storm just so you could rot in a box. It's not giving up, Saris. It's paying the bill." The connection flickered as a guard on Cale's end signaled the end of the call. "Time's up," Cale said. "Get some sleep. Princess, you have a show to put on tomorrow." He vanished. Saris stood alone in the luxurious silence, her hands curled into fists. She looked at her reflection in the dark viewport, the glowing markings, the fierce eyes. "They think justice is a math equation," she said to the empty room. "They are wrong." The grand hall of the tribunal was packed to capacity. The air was thick with the hum of recording drones and the murmur of 1,000 spectators. The hearings had dragged on for 3 weeks. It had been a parade of ghosts. Cale sat in the defendant's box, shackled to the floor. He watched as survivor after survivor from the Erythran diaspora took the stand. He listened to their stories, families separated, cultures erased, children sold into slavery by the syndicates Holt had funded. He forced himself to look at every face. He memorized their grief. It was his penance. Then came the officers. Men Kyle had flown with. Men he had drunk with. They took the stand and wept, or shouted, or sat in stony silence as they admitted to falsifying reports, to burying sensor data, to looking the other way because it was easier than asking questions. Finally, on the last day, the Chief Justice called Saras Valen. She rose from the witness bench. She was not wearing the diplomatic silk or the refugee rags. She wore a simple black suit, severe and sharp, with her hair pulled back. Her markings were fully visible, glowing with a steady, calm light. She took the podium. The Chief Justice, a Terran woman with eyes like flint, leaned forward. "Princess Valen," the justice said, "we have heard the testimony. We have seen the evidence. The guilt of Senator Holt and his cabal is clear. But we must address the instrument of this destruction." The justice gestured to the defendant's box. "Captain Riven has admitted to dropping the incendiaries. He has admitted to leading the squadron. He claims he was following orders, but he also claims he should have known better." The justice paused, the weight of the galaxy listening. "You are the victim here. Princess, you speak for the dead. What is your recommendation for the sentencing of Kale Riven?" The chamber held its breath. Kale looked up. He met Saras's eyes. His expression was open, resigned. "Tell them," he mouthed. "Truth, not kindness." Saras gripped the podium. She looked at the judges, then she looked at the cameras. "You ask for a sentence," she began, her voice ringing clear. "You want to know how many years in a cell equals a burnt planet. You want to balance the equation." She shook her head. "There is no balance. If you execute him, my world is still dead. If you lock him away for 100 years, the glass plains of Erythra will not grow grass." She turned to look at Kale. This man was a weapon. He was forged by a military-industrial complex that values obedience over morality. He pulled the trigger. "Yes, he is guilty. I will not insult the memory of my people by calling him innocent." A murmur ran through the crowd. Kyle flinched, but he nodded. "But," Saras continued, her voice rising, "if you put him in a cell, you are taking the easy way out. You are letting him hide. You are letting him sit in the dark and feel sorry for himself. And that is a luxury I refuse to grant him." She turned back to the judges. "Justice is not about punishment. Justice is about repair. You want to sentence him? Fine. Sentence him to the work." The Chief Justice frowned. "Clarify. Princess, sentence him to fix what he broke," Saras declared. "Do not let him rot. Make him build. Make him spend the rest of his life staring at the scars he made and working to heal them. That is harder than prison. That is a life sentence of conscience." The chamber erupted in whispers. The judges conferred. They turned off their microphones, their heads bent together. Minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, the Chief Justice turned back. She banged the gavel. "The tribunal has reached a verdict." She looked at Darius Holt, who was sitting in a separate holding box, pale and shaking. Darius Holt, along with the conspirators named in the evidence, are stripped of all rank and property. You are sentenced to life imprisonment in the deep orbit penal colony of Tartarus, without possibility of parole. Cheers erupted. The justice banged the gavel again. Silence. She turned to Kyle. "Kale Riven, rise." Kale stood up. The shackles clanked. "The tribunal accepts the recommendation of the victim's representative." The justice said, "We find that incarceration would serve no purpose other than waste. Therefore, you are dishonorably discharged from the coalition fleet. You are stripped of your pension and your citizenship." Kale didn't blink. "However," the justice continued, "instead of prison, you are remanded to the custody of the Erythra Restoration Initiative. You are appointed as Chief Coordinator of Logistics and Terraforming. You will serve under the direct oversight of the High Council, chaired by Princess Valen." The justice leaned back. "You broke it, Captain. You fix it. This is a lifetime appointment." You will die on that planet. Make sure you leave it better than you found it. Kale stood frozen. He wasn't free. He was bound to the dead world forever. He looked at Saris. She wasn't smiling. She was watching him with a fierce, challenging intensity. "Accept the judgment, Captain," the justice said. Kale swallowed the lump in his throat. "I accept, Your Honor." The balcony of the diplomatic suite overlooked the swirling storms of Jupiter 9. The reception inside was loud, politicians congratulating themselves on their wisdom, reporters clamoring for quotes. Kyle stood outside, gripping the railing. He was wearing civilian clothes, a gray work shirt and trousers. He had no rank. He had no home. The glass door slid open. Saris stepped out. "You are hiding again," she said. "I'm not hiding," Kyle said, not turning around. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About the fact that I am not an architect," Kyle said bitterly. "I am a pilot. I break things. I don't know how to build a world. Saris, they put the wrong man in charge." Saris walked up beside him. She leaned against the railing, the wind catching her dark hair. "They put the only man in charge who cannot walk away when it gets hard," she said. Kyle turned to her. "It feels like a trick. I should be in a cell, walking around, breathing fresh air. It feels like getting away with it." Saris grabbed his chin and forced him to look at her. Her fingers were strong. "Listen to me," she hissed. "Waking up every morning on the world you destroyed is not getting away with it. Walking through the ruins of my home every day for the next 40 years is not a vacation. It will hurt, Kyle. It will hurt every single day." She let him go. "You owe the dead more than your guilt," she said. "Guilt is cheap. Guilt is easy. I don't want your tears, Kyle. I want your sweat. I want your hands." Kyle looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. She was right. She was always right. He took a deep breath. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Saris said. "The first transport is already loaded." Erythra was not green anymore. From orbit, it looked like a polished marble. The heat of the bombardment had vitrified the surface, turning the continents into sheets of black and obsidian glass. The atmosphere was thin, hazy with dust, shimmering with a strange, auroral light caused by the lingering ionization. The transport shuttle touched down on a flat plane of obsidian. The ramp lowered. Kyle stepped out first. He was wearing an environmental suit. The helmet retracted. The air was breathable but thin and tasted of ash. He walked down the ramp and his boots clicked on the glass ground. Click, click. It was the sound of walking on a tombstone. Saris followed him. She was dressed in a heavy white ceremonial robe. She carried a small container in her hands. They walked away from the shuttle, out into the silence. The horizon was jagged with the ruins of a city that had melted. Saris stopped. She knelt on the hard, slick ground. She placed her hands flat against the glass. Kale watched as her markings began to glow. It started soft, a pulse at her neck, then spread down her arms. The light flowed from her skin into the glass. She closed her eyes. She was singing, a low, mournful sound in a language Kale didn't understand. It was the rite of return. She was calling out to the psychic echoes of the people who had died here. She was telling them she was home. The glass beneath her hands began to vibrate. Cracks appeared, spiderwebbing outward. Saris gasped, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop. She poured her energy into the dead earth, breaking the seal of the bombardment. Kale knelt beside her. He opened the container she had brought. Inside was a single seedling, a bioengineered sapling, bred to survive in high acidity soil. Its leaves were a defiant, brilliant green. Kyle took a small trowel from his belt. He jammed it into the crack Saris had made. He had to chip away at the glass, using all his strength to break through the crust to the soil beneath. He sweated. His muscles burned. He dug until his hands were blistered inside his gloves. Finally, he made a hole. He placed the seedling in the dark, dry earth. He packed the soil around it. He looked at Saris. She opened her eyes. They were shining. "It's a start," Kale whispered. Saris reached out and covered his dirt-stained hand with hers. "We have 1 billion more to plant," she said. The first year was hell. The terraforming project was a logistical nightmare. Equipment failed. Dust storms scoured the base camp. The soil was toxic. And then there was the politics. Kale was the face of the project, and half the galaxy hated him. When he walked through the spaceport terminal on supply runs, people stared. He saw the graffiti sprayed on the side of the habitat modules. Traitor. Murderer. But it wasn't just the humans. The Erythran survivors who returned were suspicious. They saw Saris as a collaborator for working with the man who had burned their homes. They held a town hall meeting in the pressurized dome of the first settlement. New Hope. The room was hostile. An Erythran elder stood up, pointing a shaking finger at Kale. "How can we trust him?" the elder demanded. "He wears the face of the enemy." Saris stood up from her chair. She didn't shout. She just walked to the center of the room and stood next to Kale. "He wears the face of the enemy," Saris agreed. "And I wear the face of your queen. And we are both standing here in the mud, working to fix the water filtration system while you argue about trust." She looked around the room. "You want to hate him? Fine. Hate him. But let him work. Judge him by the walls he builds, not the uniform he used to wear." Kale stepped forward. He pulled a datapad from his pocket. "The filtration unit is fixed. By the way," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "And we have the hydroponics bay online. We are harvesting radishes on Tuesday. If anyone wants to help, I'll be in Sector 4 at 0600. He walked out of the meeting. The next morning, at 0600, the elder was there. He didn't say a word. He just picked up a shovel. They found humor in the cracks of the exhaustion. Late one night, in the planning office, Kyle was sketching a layout for the new residential district. Saris looked over his shoulder and made a noise of disgust. "What is that?" she asked. "It's a housing block," Kyle said. "Modular units, efficient, sturdy. It is a box," Saris said. "It is a soul-crushing rectangle." "Kyle, we are Erythrans. We do not live in boxes. We need curves. We need spires. We need floating gardens." "Floating gardens?" Kyle rubbed his eyes. "Saris, we barely have gravity plating. How exactly do you propose I make the gardens float?" "Magic? Use the magnetic variance of the crystal deposits," Saris insisted, grabbing the stylus from his hand and drawing wild, impossible loops over his neat grid. "See? Like this." "That violates 3 laws of physics," Kale pointed out. "You are so boring," Saris groaned. "You have the imagination of a brick. And you have the architectural safety standards of a poet," Kale shot back. They looked at each other. Kale's hair was a mess. Saris had smudge marks of ink on her cheek. They started laughing. It was a tired, giddy laughter that shook their chests. "Fine," Kyle said, wiping his eyes. "We'll try the floating gardens. But if they crash, I'm putting 'I told you so' on the plaque." Their relationship changed. The frantic, desperate passion of the run gave way to something quieter, deeper. They lived in a small module on the edge of the settlement. At night, they would walk up the ridge to a reconstructed shrine overlooking the valley. It was a quiet night. 3 years into the project, the valley below was no longer black. Patches of green lichen were spreading across the rock. Lights from the settlement twinkled in the dark. They sat on the steps of the shrine, shoulder to shoulder. Kyle held Saris's hand, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb. "I had a nightmare last night," Kyle said quietly. "The fire?" Saris asked. "No," Kyle said. "I dreamed I was back in the squadron, and I got the order, and I said no." He looked out at the valley, and then I woke up, and I realized I can never say no. I already said yes. That moment is gone. I can't change it. Saris leaned her head on his shoulder. "No," she said. "You cannot change it. That version of you will always burn the world." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the stars. "But that is not the only version of you. Kale, I watch you with the children in the school. I watch you in the fields. You are not the fire anymore. You are the gardener." Kyle looked at her. "Do you forgive me?" he asked. He had never asked it before. Saris thought for a long time. The wind whistled through the shrine. "I will always mourn what was lost," she said, honest to the bone. "Part of me will always be angry, but I do not look at you and see a monster. I see a man who is trying." She kissed him softly. "And that is enough." Life lessons were not spoken in speeches. They were learned in the dirt. They learned that freedom was not a single check written on a data pad. It was waking up every day and choosing to stay when you wanted to run. They learned that love could not erase harm. The scars on the planet were permanent. The scars in their minds were permanent. But love could be the mortar they used to build something new on top of the ruins. They learned that responsibility was the heavy, unglamorous work of carrying the stone up the hill, day after day, without asking for applause. Time moved differently when you were building a world. Years compressed into decades. The black glass of the plane slowly disappeared under a carpet of engineered moss and tall, violet grasses. The atmosphere thickened, turning a deep, rich blue. The silence was replaced by the sound of birds and the hum of commerce. 20 years later, the settlement of New Hope was now a city. And it was not a city of boxes. It was a city of spires and curves, of crystal and steel, of human engineering blended with Erythran artistry. There were floating gardens, held up by magnetic tethers that Kale had grumbled about for 5 years before making them work perfectly. Kale stood on the balcony of their home. His hair was gray now, silver at the temples. His face was lined, weathered by the sun and the wind. He leaned on the railing, watching the street below. A group of children were racing through the plaza. Some were human, some were Erythran, and some were mixed, kids with human features and faint glowing markings on their skin. They were laughing. They were chasing a ball, screaming in a mix of trade common and Erythran. Saris stepped out onto the balcony. She moved a little slower now, but she was still regal, still luminous. She wore a robe of blue silk that shimmered in the afternoon light. She stood beside him and took his hand. Her fingers interlocked with his, a fit that had become as natural as breathing. "Look at them," she said softly. "They do not know the war. They know the history," Kyle said. "We teach them." "Yes," Saris said, "but they do not feel the heat. To them, the fire is just a story." She leaned into him, resting her head against his arm. She looked at the city they had built. She looked at the man who had stood beside her through every broken pipe, every political crisis, every nightmare. She smiled, a half smile that echoed the girl in the cage from a lifetime ago. "Once, you tried to own me," she murmured. the old joke warm with tenderness. Kale smiled, looking down at her. He squeezed her hand. Now you're stuck belonging here with me instead. She finished. Kyle laughed softly. It was a sound of pure contentment, light and unburdened. He kissed her forehead, right over the glowing constellation at her temple. If this is my sentence, Kale said, looking at the city, looking at her, looking at the life that had grown from the ashes, I accept it gladly. The camera of history pulled back. It rose above the balcony, above the two silhouettes framed by the growing light. It rose above the floating gardens and the crystal spires. It rose until it showed the whole planet, a sphere of green and blue and violet, healing in the dark, spinning beneath a sky that was no longer on fire. The story ended, but the life went on. But the life